Workshop goals. First thing to talk about is just what is this, why is everyone here? What do we want to convey with this workshop? And I think number one is we want everyone to leave here today with a better understanding of how the foot connects to the hip, why we run into so many issues with our feet and ankles especially. And if you have issues at feet, ankles, or hips, what are the go-to mobilizations that seem to be effective for us and our patients that you can start to work on? So that's really kind of what we're going to go through. You know, a big goal of the workshop is also to get people thinking differently about footwear, thinking differently about the fact that your feet are important, because we never used to really think feet were important. It was never emphasized in school, and so until we actually took a closer look at it, we didn't really have any motivation to actually explore that area. And also thinking differently about spending time sitting in chairs, because I think it's something all of us do a lot of and we take for granted. And it's hard to see the direct consequences of spending time sitting in chairs, and it's hard for some people to develop strategies to be able to modify that, right? Sitting is so deeply ingrained in our society that it's almost something that if you go somewhere to a party and you don't sit, it's like you're the weirdo that people are asking, do you want a chair? So we need to just have a conversation about how does sitting affect our bodies? How do we modify the amount of sitting that we do during the day? And then if you want to offset the effects of sitting, here are the mobilizations we're having the best luck with. So getting that across I think is important. And then obviously talking about footwear, because footwear is, you know, the bigger conversation is the hip and how that affects the foot, but another conversation is isolated foot issues have a lot to do with the footwear that we put on top of our feet. And I think our goal with talking about footwear is not to tell people what to wear on their feet, is to give people the information they need to make good decisions, right? To understand what to look for in a shoe, not what shoe is the best shoe, it's what to look for in footwear when you buy it, what to avoid in footwear if possible when you buy it, because that really has a lot more to do with the state of your feet than adding a bunch of extra stuff to do during the day. So, you know, our approach is really trying to find the root cause. I think the medical system, especially in Canada, it gets very caught up in treating people's symptoms, where the pain is, and it doesn't do a very good job at, number one, treating why the pain is there, or number two, teaching people health. Like, we manage problems, we manage pain and disease, we don't teach people health of how to prevent these things in future and understanding why they're even there in the first place. So I think that's really our approach really is get to the root cause of why these issues are there, which is a much bigger conversation and can be intimidating for some people, but we're here to simplify feet and hips. We're not here to make it complex, right? Because it's actually very easy to make things complex, but can be very difficult to simplify, you know, those two areas and still make it so that people have actionable things that they can do and start with, like today, tomorrow, whether it's on themselves or with your patients. I think it's, you know, one thing I want to just mention is foot dysfunction. Okay, foot dysfunction is an epidemic. When we started looking into feet and really assessing feet in clinic and getting every patient take their shoes off and looking at their feet, we realized that it's almost like it's extremely rare to see someone with functional feet. And so why does everyone have messed up feet? Number one, when you understand the role that the hip plays on the foot and that connection, you realize that a lot of us have hip dysfunctions, so it's not much of a surprise that we have a foot dysfunction. But second to that, we all wear shoes that really aren't built for human feet. And I mean, I think a third reason why foot dysfunction is such an epidemic is most people with dysfunctional feet do not have foot pain. And so they don't even know that their feet aren't doing what they're supposed to. So we really don't have a good idea of what normal or what natural feet should actually look like, or what they should do. So we'll talk about that a little bit today.
One of the big things too that people don't understand is that the positioning of your pelvis and your hip and what your hips are doing shows up downstream. So we always say posture ends at the ground, right? So you can tell a lot about what's happening upstream based on somebody's foot position. And again, whether or not that foot is painful at the time, it's kind of a smoke signal saying, like, you know, even watching somebody balance on one foot, what's happening there? Are they able to control themselves, or are things kind of going all around, right? Because we can look up the chain and say what's happening if your foot's not doing its thing, or if it's in a position there. It's telling you ankle, knee, everything upstream is not kind of aligned well, right? And it's very simple to really coach that. We can use functional movements like a squat to really try to ingrain this kind of linkage and this connection from the hips down to the floor. So I think it's hard because people just look at, if they develop foot pain, they're like, well, what's wrong with my foot? And it's not that simple. It's not just there's something wrong with your foot. It's this kind of whole chain and how you're using that foot with the rest of the body.
Yeah. It also says protect, correct, develop on the side of your sheet there. So that's really this kind of overarching paradigm that we use in terms of developing plans when we see people with an issue. And what we realized was that, you know, a couple years ago, we were doing a really good job at getting good at the correct part. So someone comes in, for example, patient X comes in, they got a stiff hip. Okay, you're missing hip rotation, you're missing hip extension. Here are mobilizations to help open up your hip again. And we were working really hard to get good at that, but what we found is that we were actually underemphasizing the whole protect part. So protect is help that person understand why that stiffness developed in the first place. Because patients were getting slow, they were making progress doing these mobilizations at home, but if patient X does 30 minutes of hip mobility a day and then spends 10 hours a day stiffening their hip up again, it's gonna be very slow progress. It's gonna be frustrating a lot of times. So the protect part is explain to people, and that's all done through education, right? Explain to people, this is why your hip's getting stiff in the first place. Let's have a bigger conversation about modifying the things that cause your hip to get stiff, and then we can talk about opening up and mobilizing your hip, but that's really not the hard part. The hard part is changing your day-to-day life in a way that ingrains more movement and less sitting in a chair. And so that's what we'll talk about. And today we talk about protect, correct. Develop is layering on strength, capacity, power, mileage on top of joints that move like they're supposed to and a baseline level of movement software. And we often talk about the hardware-software differentiation. So hardware is do your joints move like human joints are supposed to move. Software is once you have joints that move like they're supposed to, software is getting your brain to layer on optimal movement patterns. But it always starts with mobility, because if you don't have the hardware, you can't coach good movement on someone that doesn't have hardware that moves like it's supposed to. So we'll use sometimes the term hardware software throughout this, and that's kind of what we're talking about. So let's get into feet. In terms of anatomy, we don't get super deep into anatomy, because although the foot is insanely complex in terms of its machinery and what it does, you don't need to know every intricate complexity of the foot in order to actually fix feet or understand what you need to do to make sure you have functional feet. Okay, so in terms of anatomy, each foot has 26 bones, 33 joints, 4 layers of muscle. It's a very busy area despite being so tiny. You know, 25% of all the bones you have in your whole body are in your feet. And we kind of take them for granted, right? We cover them up, we put them in shoes, we cover them up, we don't talk about them, but they're pretty darn important. And the primary role that your feet play, what's one of the primary roles that your feet play? Just yell it out. Pardon?
They communicate with your environment.
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect. That's exactly what I was looking for. They're a sensor, right? They're a sensor to give you sensory input about the ground you're standing on. If we make an analogy to another sensor, your eyes are a sensor as well, right? They visually take in information about the environment so that your brain has that information to decide how to navigate the environment. If you want to protect your eyes from the sun, what do you put on top of them? You put sunglasses on. You don't put a blindfold on. If you put a blindfold on, it takes away the ability of the sensor to take in the information. Most people are blindfolding their feet. So if you take your foot, which is designed to sense information about the environment, and you stick a big layer of air or foam between your foot and the ground, all of a sudden you've protected that sensor, and you should protect it. It's an important sensor, but don't do it at the expense of taking away its ability to act as a sensor. And so that's where, you know, a lot of people, you take away that slab of cushioning or that air bubble underneath their foot, their balance improves automatically. Why? Because they're actually feeling the ground, they're actually stable on the ground. We see this with older patients all the time. People are in their 70s and 80s, come into the clinic, they're wearing shoes that are literally like concrete bricks of padding. And they walk around with this very shuffling, uncertain gait, almost like they're walking on ice. You take their shoes off, which is something they've been told, some of them, to never do, and they immediately feel more stable. Without saying anything, their balance improves, they have more fluid arm swing, and it's like, what just happened? And when you realize that their brain just realized that they just felt the ground for the first time in a while, it's not as much of a surprise. But it seems weird that they're being put in these shoes by the medical community when it's so obvious that the feet need to act as a sensor, especially as your balance gets worse.
The feet are also stabilizers too, so sensors and stabilizers. Now, one concept that we want to get across today, that there's, as Nick said, there's 4 layers of muscle in the feet, and these are responsible for actually gripping and stabilizing and finding that balance on the ground. But it's not, but it's the role of everything above the foot to actually put the foot in a position where it can actually use its stability and take advantage of that stability role. So if you picture, we'll talk about foot position, foot posture, we'll talk about the tripod rule. So these are all saying the same thing. Basically, the position of your foot matters. Then we can use it as a stabilizer. We can't use it as a stabilizer if its position isn't good, right? And it's the hip, it's the lower leg muscles, it's this whole chain above that that's responsible for putting it where we can actually use it, right? And that's where people have trouble. It's also almost this isolated approach to in rehab. So we see people with plantar fasciitis or issues at their foot, and they're given like isolated foot exercises. So they're trying to like, you know, stretch towels and stuff, but there's no kind of attention to this whole mechanism of like everything above it, places it where it can work, then we need it to work there, right? So That's
Yeah.
just something to note throughout. It's a sensor and a stabilizer. It can't demonstrate either of those if the shoes on your feet are affecting that, or if you're not addressing the chain upstream of that.
So you're right. It's a stabilizer, sensor. It's also your foundation. So if you go up to someone and you're saying, and you say, I want to build a building. I want it to be a really strong, resilient building that's going to last for a long time. The engineer, the first thing they work on is the foundation, because if the foundation sucks, everything upstream doesn't matter. And I think a lot of people are investing a lot of time and energy building the building upstream, right? Working on their quad strength or their hips or their core or whatever. But everyone, even at the elite level, seems to be neglecting their foundation, which if there's a crack in your foundation, everything else upstream starts to be at a disadvantage, right? We treat a good amount of powerlifters, and some of the powerlifters we get in are reaching a plateau in their lifts, and all you do is get them to train just a baseline level of function. I'm not talking about like every workout spending an hour on their feet to build mutant strong feet. I'm talking about like, let's just make sure your feet are doing the bare minimum and all their lifts go up. And it's because their feet was a linchpin to limiting their expression of strength they already had, but they weren't being allowed to express because their brain didn't feel stable downstream of their foundation. So a little bit of work there. It's a very low-hanging fruit in the world of performance and athletics. Second to sleep and diet. I think if a lot of people spent just a little bit of time making sure their feet did what they were supposed to and spent time barefoot, they would notice big differences that come out of nowhere in terms of their performance. So sometimes that's how you get the buy-in.
A lot of times it's making them work harder too. So oftentimes the shoes that we're wearing, the arch supports and all of these things, they're making our feet work less, and that's the issue. We want them to actually work more, because by working more, we're going to gain more strength, resilience, and then we're going to see these other things go up like performance and all of that. So it's this weird thing. As soon as we find, oh, your feet aren't doing what they should be doing, we say, okay, we're going to support them and make them work less, right? But then it furthers this kind of dysfunction in a lot of cases because they're not having to do their job even more so, right? So it's just flipping it on its head and saying, okay, we need to actually look at what they should be doing, and let's get them doing more work in any given situation, from somebody just walking around daily to an elite powerlifter who can get more out of their lifts by stabilizing better. So,
yeah. So we're going to start with hardware. We're going to start digging into the hardware of the feet and restoring a bit of that. If we look at the protect, correct sequence, protect is, if each foot has 33 joints. So if you look at a joint is adapted into our body because it's designed for movement, right? I don't have a joint in the middle of my forearm because I don't have to bend the middle of my forearm, but I need an elbow joint so I can feed myself and throw stuff. So a joint is there because it's designed for movement. If you have 33 joints in each foot, that means there's supposed to be a ton of movement in each foot. And if you wear a shoe that when you pick up the shoe, you can't bend it, twist it, do anything with it, it's not going to allow your foot to do any of those movements, right? So step one, protect your feet. If you want to restore mobility in your foot, if all you did was go barefoot or wear shoes that allowed uninhibited motion of your foot, you will automatically have more mobile and stronger feet. This is just the stuff we're going to go through is just stuff if you want to speed up the progress a little bit or get there faster, you can do extra stuff to speed up the process of mobilizing those joints. So that's what we're going to talk about. So we're going to go through a couple different things, but always keep in mind that the protect part is the most important part. Okay, these mobilizations help, but if you go back into shoes that are stiff or narrow or squish your foot together, don't allow your foot to articulate, it'll be very hard to get meaningful, lasting progress. Okay, so we're going to talk about opening up the bottom of the foot, the joints and the muscles. That's the first one we're going to start with our lacrosse balls. We're going to go into opening up the toes and restoring a little bit of toe alignment and splay. So for people that have any kind of bunions or foot or toe alignment issues, this can be a very powerful thing to kind of work on. We're going to talk about ankles. So we're going to go through the key mobilizations that we use with people a lot and a couple progressions of it to open up your ankles, because that's a big problem for a lot of people, right? A big limiter for people's movement quality, right? Like ankles show up in everything. Ankles show up with walking, lunging, doing stairs, doing a squat. So if you've got ankles that are locked up and not moving, it's going to affect all those other movement patterns. And it might not be causing pain right now, but when you compensate and work around an ankle mobility restriction, you eventually hit a wall. Usually that's the cartilage in your knee has a hole worn in it because your knees aren't able to align themselves or do what they're supposed to because your ankle can't move. So we're going to talk about ankles. And the protect part with ankles is most shoes you can buy now, most conventional footwear has a positively heeled, has a positive heel, which means that the heel is higher than the forefoot. Humans aren't designed to walk around on ramps all day. Okay, we're supposed to walk around on flat ground. So getting rid of the ramp on your shoe, which puts your heel slightly above the ground, is usually a very big contributing factor for the reason that your ankle can't go in the opposite direction. Okay, so getting rid of the heel on your footwear will automatically improve your ankle range because when you walk, you can use more of it. When you squat, lunge, you can use more of it. So we'll go over that. And then after the hardware part of restoring those, we're going to talk about software. So we're going to talk about, the only one we're going to talk about is short foot. How do you contract the intrinsic muscles of your foot? And we're also going to talk about how, that ties in right into a conversation about how your hip affects your foot position. Because the way we're thinking about it right now is your hips position your feet, the muscles of your foot can then contract to hold the foot in a stable position. But unless your hip can organize it in the first place and align all the bones in the right spot, you can't really do much with the intrinsic muscles of the foot. It just doesn't work. It's like trying to use your core if your pelvis is dumped forward and your ribs are flared up. Good luck firing your core very well. It's not in the position to fire. Same thing with the foot and the hip. So we're going to talk about that relationship, and then after the foot, we'll get into the hips. Okay? So everyone grab a lacrosse ball. If you brought one, grab it. If you didn't, you can come grab one up front here. Okay, and then we'll get everyone standing up. And the first exercise we're going to do, we call this the plantar release. Now, if anyone doesn't have a lacrosse ball and wants to take one of these ones home, they're $5. So, but literally it's just a run-of-the-mill lacrosse. We like very inexpensive, cheap tools because it's weird. If you add if a ball is all of a sudden specifically used for tissue work, it seems to make the price 4 times for some reason. So, okay. Plantar release. So what is this releasing? This is releasing the joints. This is releasing the muscles. This is opening up the fascia. It's basically just opening up everything on the bottom of your foot. Okay, after spending a lot of time on hard, flat surfaces and not a lot of texture, we lose the ability to articulate the foot. So the minimum effective dose that we've found has been successful for people to get a change in their foot pain. Someone comes in, I've had plantar fasciitis for 5 years, my feet hurt every day, what can I do? The minimum effective dose is 2 minutes per foot, twice a day for 2 weeks. 2, 2, 2. 2 minutes per foot, twice a day for 2 weeks. What we found is that after that period of time, if you've had pain for 5 years, I'm not saying you're going to have no pain after 2 weeks, but you should notice a difference in your foot symptoms. Okay, and if that's the case, you just keep doing it and you'll eventually be able to put more pressure and release all these things. Okay, so what does that 2 minutes consist of? The only area you don't have to roll is your heel bone. Okay, your calcaneus is basically just a bone with a little layer of fat over it. You don't have to release anything there because there's not really much to release. Everything in front of the heel is fair game. So the first minute, all I want you to do is start on the inside arch of the foot and just go up and down, and then very slowly shift over and move over towards the outside of the foot. It's real complex stuff. Okay? Now, a couple things here. Number one, how hard should you push? Well, it shouldn't tickle, so you should push hard enough that it's slightly uncomfortable, like a deep massage, but not pushing so hard that you're making weird faces and trying to swear at people. Okay? So that pressure will change as time goes on. And just to give you an idea of how much pressure you should be able to put if you don't have tension in those muscles or your joints aren't locked up, you should be able to stand on one foot. Well, try this now. The balance part's hard, but you should be able to stand on one foot with no pain, really. And that took me a while to be able to do, but that gives you an idea. If a muscle's not locked up and tight and the joints are mobile, your foot can kind of adapt itself and over the ball, and your muscles are resilient to being able to have pressure put on them without giving pain signals. So first minute is up and down.
What is this mimicking? It's just like what our foot should naturally be able to do. So if you go, for instance, on a hike with minimalist shoes, you'll be stepping over roots, rocks, all of that, and it's like this is happening every second, right? Every step you take, this is happening, right? So basically we have to go out of our way and mimic this because we're always on flat surfaces, so our feet just get used to being non-resilient basically because they're never kind of pushed open, pried open and all of that. So think about it that way. You're just naturally mobilizing everything like you're walking through a forest.
So 1 minute of going up and down, pressure as tolerated. Over time you should find that you're having to put more pressure to get that same feeling of tolerable discomfort. The second part, second minute, is heel bone on the floor, ball at the base of your pinky toe. And then starting at the base of the toes, you put pressure, keeping your heel on the floor, you put pressure and go from side to side. Okay, and what you're going to find, especially if you go to the base of the toes, when you put pressure there, your foot almost cups around the ball. Okay, all your kind of foot knuckles end up showing, they all splay open. And this splaying effect where your foot kind of widens and cups around the round ball ends up doing a really good job at offsetting the effects of shoes that compress your foot. Okay, so Morton's neuroma is something that we see commonly. It's a nerve between the metatarsals of the foot that gets compressed because of narrow footwear. This is a really nice way to kind of open up all the fascia and the skin and get those bones splayed out again. Because what should be the widest part of the human foot? Does anyone know? Tips of the toes. Same thing as the widest part on a baby's foot. The widest part of most of our feet is the base of our big toe. Why? Because that's the widest part of shoes. And so shoes end up determining the shape of our foot, and it takes it away from the natural shape, which fans out with all the toes kind of splaying out. So that one's a really basic one. 1 minute up and down, 1 minute side to side, enough pressure that it's some tolerable discomfort, okay? You know, if you limp around or have foot pain the rest of the day, you push too hard. If you're not really feeling any discomfort when you're doing this, you're probably not pushing hard enough. So that becomes something where you have to self-regulate and determine the pressure as time goes on. Yep.
Can you do this sitting down?
You can do it sitting down, for sure. And some people, if you have, yep, you can, for sure. People with super tender feet might only be able to do it sitting down because the pressure of more body weight when they're standing might be too much. I think it's more effective when you're standing because you can put more weight into it. But at the same time, if sitting is all you have access to, do it sitting, do it regularly. You know, and the hardest part with this is actually being consistent with it, right? Like our jobs as physios a lot of times boils down to helping people and like giving them strategies for behavior change way more than the information we're giving them. You know, I had a lawyer, she wears heels every day. She's had foot pain basically for like 10 years, but she just thought it was a normal side effect of wearing her shoes, which it is. But her hardest part was, how do I can't be consistent with this. I'm having a hard time. So strategy one was put lacrosse balls all over her house, and she still didn't do it. The strategy that worked for her was, you know, what do you do twice a day automatically? You brush your teeth. So she puts a lacrosse ball beside her toothbrush. She does it while she's brushing her teeth. It gets done every day. And then after a week of doing that, she had a habit, and it's part of her day now. And that's the best way to ingrain something and be consistent is couple it with something you're already doing every day. Okay? Try the other foot just quickly. So same thing. A lot of times people have one foot that's more tender than the other. For a lot of people initially this sucks, right? It's not comfortable. It's not fun to do. But eventually when you get a baseline of foot mobility, this actually feels real good.
It is, yeah.
Okay? So that's plantar release. Very simple. All you need is a $5 lacrosse ball, and you just got to be consistent with it. So.
All right, so I'm going to get everyone to go down to the ground now. We're going to do the next hardware release around the foot. So basically, we call this the human toe spreader. We're going to try to interlace our fingers between our toes, and we're going to try to get to the point where we can make almost a fist around our forefoot and move it around. So I'll demo here first. Take one of your foot, put it over your knee, and you can gradually just take your time and try to work your way in. This might be easier for some people than others. So again, just gradually work your way in to the point where if you can make like a fist around your forefoot, at that point you can start to slowly maneuver around. And you can start to get more aggressive with this over time, but I'm just twisting side to side. I'm pulling back, I'm pulling forward, back, forward, side to side. So it doesn't really matter what you do. You're essentially just playing with the forefoot here with your fingers interlaced. And that's just giving a little bit, basically you're mushing everything out, right? You're opening up this hardware. You're also kind of signifying to your brain that you're able to move this area, right?
Now this shouldn't hurt, right? If this hurts, it's one of two things. Number one, your foot is tight from the shoes that you've been wearing and your toes have been squished together. Or number two, you just have really thick fingers. So it's, we had a bricklayer at one of our seminars and he's like, this really hurts. I was like, oh, you got tight feet, man. And he went like this. I was like, you got sausage fingers. I take that back. So, but just be gradual. Like be very gentle with it. Start easy. You know, this is something that anyone can do. The whole point with toe spreaders is it allows you to do this for longer periods of time without having your fingers between your foot all the time.
This is something you can do in front of the TV too, right? Yeah. Just when you're on the ground. Keep working on it. We'll take our fingers out in a second, and then we're going to actually put our foot in front of us and we're going to compare it to the other side and see how far we can split our toes out. So typically, again, this is more hardware. We're opening up mobility a little bit. We want to take advantage of that after. So a lot of the times, if you involve your musculature after and you try to update the software with the new hardware that you've gained, that's going to make it more long-lasting, as opposed to doing this and then shoving your foot back in a shoe that's compressing everything. So let's take the fingers out and we'll put our foot right beside the other one and just see if you can see any difference between these sides there and your ability to splay all of your toes apart and try to separate them. And you may or may not, and this is something that will take effect over time. But sometimes I'll just do that for a minute per side, and then I'll just sit here looking at my toes, just trying to splay them out as far as I can, letting them relax, splay them out as far as I can. And you'll start to notice, again, this is a time thing, but you'll notice end goal is to develop more space between your toes because ideally they shouldn't be all touching at rest, right? So let's go to the other foot and we'll do the same thing and we'll gradually work our fingers through.
I think everyone would agree that balancing on something that's wide is easier than balancing on something that's narrow. So one of the easiest ways you can increase and improve your balance is just widen your foot out because you have a wider base to kind of balance on. And so that's, you know, this side effect of narrow shoes is that we've lost the ability to have this nice wide platform to balance our bodies on. And your toes are actually very important for balance, right? They're like these little tentacles that tell you where your pressure is and can help correct positions and help make sure that your foot stays stable. But if your foot ends up getting squished and those toes can't independently move, and because toes do virtually nothing in most shoes, I think a lot of people's brains actually forget that they have toes. You know, they're these things that are just there, but they're not really signaling. The muscles aren't really working. And so part of this is, you know, a lot of people don't like to touch their feet. You know, part of that is because they're self-conscious that their feet might stink, but they only stink because you put them in shoes that don't breathe all day. And so just getting people familiar with opening up their toes and just having your fingers between each toe is reminding your brain that your toes exist and that they can actually be used for motion. And so doing this it might seem silly, but for a lot of people, it can have longer reaching effects than just having your toes splay out. So.
All right, let's take, question?
Toe splay is when I start working on toe splay with some people, they start getting really excessive toe dorsiflexion.
Yep.
Is it still productive, and can you, like, what's a way of kind of backing off of that?
When you say toe dorsiflexion, what do you mean?
Like their toes are flexing, like if I pull someone into dorsiflexion, their toes are flexing more than their ankle. Kind of like that foot rock, that, you know, I don't know, shoe rock that you guys had a post about.
Yep. Yep.
Definitely those are clog wearers, but is there a way of getting them to still work at that splay without encouraging more of that?
Lower threshold strategies, because a lot of people try to flex everything all at once. So oftentimes oftentimes it's just a mind game. And again, this is not the be all end all. We'll do a little drill in a second to ingrain that, but taking it a bit easier and not trying to go hard at it all at once, because that's just going to fire into whatever strategy they'd like to use in the first place.
Part of it's just practice. Like if they do that, it just means that their toe extension and toe abduction or splay, those two motor patterns are together. They're intertwined like this. So you almost have to, they just have to literally visually look at their foot with their foot on the ground and work on being able to splay without extending. And all it might take is a couple movements where they get that, and then they now know the pattern of how to splay or abduct without extension. But you have to split those two because everything's, you know, that's why a lot of people, like, when they splay their toes, their tongue goes one way, their fingers go all weird. It's just like everything is this global motor pattern in their brain. And it's just like reacquainting your brain with the fact that you can have fine-tuning control over those muscles without coupling 5 movements together. So.
All right, let's come back to our feet. We'll just do a little bit of a toe exercise, and then we'll go into the ankle after that. So all we're going to do is look down at one of our foot, put it in front of us. And we're going to first start with keeping our big toe down if we can. This is just a motor control exercise and bringing our other toes up in the air. We'll see if we can do that. Give you a little time to try that. Now if we can do that, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to put all of our little toes down. We're going to bring our big toe up. And we're just going to see if we can do that. Work it out for a minute if you can. We'll do the opposite. We'll go back to big toe down, try to get the little toes up, and also try to splay all those little toes apart when you do that too. Now go back to little toes down, big toe up, and then we're going to go actually back, forth in a minute there, in a second. All right, so if everyone's ready, we're going to try to go and switch it. Every time I say switch, we're going to go big toe down, big toe up, etc. So big toe down, switch, 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 and switch. There we go. So let's go to the other side. This is just, again, more of that motor control. A lot of people have a tough time just looking down at their toes and having them do what you're asking them to do. But this is, again, little kind of, it's just an insight into how little our brain kind of connects with our toes. That's all it is. And it's helpful for waking things up. This is not going to turn your feet into, like, you know, beast strength-wise. It's just a matter of the more they can do to you and the more you can communicate with them, the more they're there for you. So let's go to the other side and we'll try the same thing. Start the big toe down. Try to bring the little toes up. And then you can do the little switch there. Take your time with this. And again, switch. This time try to splay even wider if you can with all those little toes. And big toe up. And now we will do the switches. So big toe down, switch, 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 and switch.
So it's really just practice. It's like, this is all brain work. And once you can do it, you don't have to do it every day. But I think getting to the point where your brain, like we said, acknowledges the ability of fine-tuning control over different toes, I think is a fun mental game that anyone can do, right? It's just time spent doing it. So, ankle?
If you can't get separation even the slightest bit, what do you guys start? I mean, you get like manually help assist?
Yep.
Sometimes we'll do that, yeah.
You mean separation in terms of the toes
Just
going
the toes
independently?
and the finger, yeah, just
Yep.
if you can't do
Yep.
square one.
Yep, and what I'll do usually is like, say all they can do is lift all the toes or put all the toes down. I'll get them to manually hold down the little toes and do some big toe stuff. And you're just trying to differentiate, put a block in those two patterns, and eventually they'll be able to get it. It's like you'll try it 10 times, and on the 9th time, a light bulb will go off, and you'll get a little flicker where you did it slightly differently, and then it's just motor programming. And as soon as you get that wiring back, then it's super easy. But that first step can be frustrating for people, and those are typically the people that have spent the least time barefoot, wear shoes that are extremely compressive. Their brain has essentially completely forgotten that they have fine-tuned control over their toes. And that's not the be-all, end-all of all this stuff, but it is, we find it is a part, and it's beneficial because if your brain acknowledges your toes, which is shown by the fact that you can articulate them independently, it will now start to use your toes when you're walking, when you're moving, right? It'll use them reflexively if you create those communication pathways consciously. Because some people say like, oh, well, who cares about moving the toes? It's like, well, it means something way deeper. It means your brain knows your toes are there. We don't really care if people can move their toes independently, but we do care that their brain can acknowledge the toes as in separate motor units.
In the, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Should it go like straight up? Because I think when I was starting this, my big toe would go off like to
Yep,
the side.
that's common. Like shoes push our toes kind of in together. So a lot of times you try and extend your toe, it'll go kind of on an angle. You just work at it because it's the same thing. Your brain thinks that extending your toe, when you tell your toe to extend, it both extends and adducts. So it's like those two things are together. And until you practice it and just kind of work on it, it's almost like you're staring at your toe and trying to tell it what to do, and you might have to yell at it a couple times mentally, and then it'll eventually listen. So.
All right, so we're gonna head on to the ankle a little bit. And the ankle, as we said before, very important, shows up in a lot of patterns, and it's kind of this linchpin area. It's almost a roadblock for a lot of people that affects a lot of movement patterns. Things like going downstairs, which a lot of people need to do, walking, which is pretty much everybody needs to do, runners with stiff ankles are gonna have some problems, squatting, all of these other patterns, right? So ankle, we're gonna talk about dorsiflexion. Primarily, we're going to talk about a little bit about plantar flexion as well. Dorsiflexion is when your knee tracks kind of over your foot. So the bend in the ankle there, it's bringing your foot towards you. And that's where people tend to have the most trouble. So there's many things that can affect it. The ankle joints, I think it comes down to not using our ankle joints and not exposing them to end range dorsiflexion a lot. That limits that, but there's a lot of things that can cause that as well. Heeled footwear. The fact that we don't get into squats and things like that anymore, the fact that we don't use our ankles as much as we should. But we're going to go over a few ways just to start to work in end range and see what it feels like. So we're going to offer some suggestions here. Now, each one might not be right for everybody. So again, these are just techniques and tools. They're not like the things you absolutely need to do. We can always backtrack, progress or regress depending on where somebody's at, your clients or yourself. So the first one we're going to do, it's basically down into a crouch position. So people, you can all come down again.
So what we're going to work on here is showing you different ways to put your ankle at end range, right? So there's a lot of reasons people's ankles don't move. Number one, the joint might just be tight because you've never actually gone into that position before. Another thing that's common with a lot of people is their calves are really tight, right? So if you test your ankle range, so we don't go through the specific assessment of the ankle because it's only a 2-hour workshop, so we can't do as much. But what we'll do to assess that is essentially against the wall, get someone to lunge forward with their knee over their third toe, and they'll slowly inch their foot out little bit by little bit. That's not really a wall, but until they can just touch their knee without their heel lifting off, and then we'll actually measure how far is the distance between their toe and the wall. And that gives you a hard number to say how much ankle dorsiflexion do you have. A good ankle screen for a lot of people, if you want to know if you have the ankles aren't the only thing that can stop you from doing this, but a foot together squat where you go down into kind of a relaxed squat position, that tells you you have enough ankle dorsiflexion. If you can't do that, it doesn't necessarily mean it's just your ankles are the problem, but for a lot of people, they can't do this without feeling like they're gonna go like this. And so oftentimes, you know, what we're trying to get at there is find some sort of way to check your ankles before and check your ankles after you've done some work, just to make sure that you're actually improving. For a lot of people, even just a barefoot, hip width apart bodyweight squat like this will be a good test of their ankle mobility.
So the more he can get his knees over, the more he has the ability to stay upright. If you kind of, because he can actually go back like this, and now he's going to be holding on for dear life. The less dorsiflexion he has, the harder it is to get in this position. So if you can really dial in that ankle range, he has more stability there.
Why doesn't everyone try a barefoot squat right now, just to see? So try it, try standing up, keep your heels glued, and just go down slowly and see what you have to do to keep your heels on the ground. There you go. So you're pretty good. Now, you see how your toes are lifting up? So an easy way to test for you, if it's chiefly your ankles or if it's something upstream like your hips or your software, is to put a little lift under your heels, and if you can go all the way down real nice and easy, then it tells you the only variable you've modified there is your ankles. So if it's easy to do with something under your heels, then working on your ankle mobility is probably going to be able to get you to doing a barefoot bodyweight squat no problem. So,
but if you spent time, well, we'll get into that now, because if you spend time in that squat position, that's a good way to assess it, because you're just directly like, I can't get in this position because of my ankles. Let's just try to just get in this position more. So the first way we're going to do things today is just almost this crouched position. Now you can actually work on, if you sit back on this back ankle, we're going to get into a little plantar flexion release in a second, but that's accomplishing the same thing when you sit back and you're going to open up that front of your shin. But we're concentrating on this front ankle for the purposes of this. I typically like to leave it a little bit behind this knee, and that way I can get more leverage. So what I'm trying to do is actually get myself to lever into this ankle as much as possible. So you don't have to be perfect, but you want this knee kind of traveling over where the foot is, right? So you can go in a little bit, outside, inside a little bit, but you don't want to kind of going all the way over here, dumping way to the inside of the foot. So what I like to do is kind of get my chest into my thigh here, and that allows me to create like leverage here. Now, one thing I like to do is use external cueing. That shows up a lot in our courses. Meaning, if I think about reaching for this ball over here, I've created this leverage. I'm kind of getting my chest right into my thigh, and I can try to reach both hands out to this ball. So as I try to reach and touch it, it's going to drive me as far as I can into my ankle. So I can reach for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, back off, trying to keep the heel down. You can also lift the heel up a little bit if you want, and that's just going to get in there slightly differently. So you can kind of rock back and forth into it, really reach. And that reach is just going to kind of drive it. Now, there's other methods that you can do here. The big thing is just trying to get to that end range and hold it there. We're going to do a couple activation exercises in a second too.
And even for a lot of people, oscillating can be fairly comfortable. So what I mean by that is instead of going to the end and holding there for long periods, just kind of rocking on to, like, go to your limit and then relax. Go to your limit and relax. It's almost like you're trying to convince your brain to open up that ankle compartment to get it moving a little bit more.
So there's different ways that you can progress all of these things that we show. That's the first, is just kind of exposing your ankles to that range.
That's okay. So put this.
But for instance, if I pick up a weight here, if I'm at end range here and I'm kind of leaning forward, once I grab a weight here, it really allows me to lever myself into that. So my chest is kind of going down and I'm just picking up a weight here. And it just feels really good. I feel it all through my Achilles. You can pick up a heavier weight if you want. I don't recommend going this heavy right off the bat, but if you pick this up, automatically I'm really into my ankle and I have to stabilize in that position because this weight's pulling me forward, right? So it can be something as simple as that. Now, another way you can do things is that it's more principles that we want to get across. So external cueing, reaching, driving into this position, using external loading, because that can apply more leverage to that. And then also what you can do, once you get to end range, thinking about, so if everyone goes to the end of their ankle range, thinking about pushing all of the toes hard into the ground for 5 seconds. So once you're there, push them all into the ground, especially the bases of the toes, not just the tips. And that you're going to find that things just really activate around that ankle. Things are working. So you can do that for 5 seconds. We're going to do the opposite now. And once you're at in-range ankle, you're going to try to pick all your toes off the ground. So you're going to try to pick them up hard off the ground. And again, you're going to feel likely the front of your shin really light up. And you can combine that again with the weight and the load. You can try to push down, pick up, all of that. So this is just kind of putting your ankle where it, likely past where it usually goes, and then just doing a bunch of experimentation, loading it, contracting it, relaxing it, working it into that range to make it more permanent. So the reason why we show that one, it's fairly comfortable with some people. Some people that's going to be a little too aggressive, depending on the population that you're working with. So we can go kind of elsewhere. We can stand on our feet and do different methods. The next one we're going to do is just, we're going to go back to that squat position, because the squat's a great way to load your ankle. And again, if somebody doesn't have their squat, can't discomfort, we're not going to go here, obviously. But that's just kind of the same methods can be used. If everyone gets in a squat, you can try to do some of these reaches. And I find reaching out one way, driving that knee kind of right over that middle of the foot somewhere, trying to touch something on the ground, keep that heel down, reach, 5 seconds. Come around the corner, go into the other side, reach. And I like this kind of rocking back and forth here, just using the ankles in that range.
So for you, holding on to like a railing.
Just be mindful of what your ankles are doing. A lot of people can get it in the squat, but they don't think about exactly where their ankles are and how far they're getting into them. Again, if we had weights for everyone, you can try it. If anyone wants to try one, you can. But just picking up a weight here, and again, using that leverage. One of my favorite ways to work on my ankle here. Now, a lot of people will choose to do something like this. I find that's good too. It's more passive. I find if I just pick up an external load, it forces me to use my ankle range. So that works well too. Come to the other side, etc. Right, and then we can do the same thing. So on each foot, you can push down into the ground for 5 seconds with all of your toes. You can then try to lift all your toes off the ground. You can just get used to yourself being there. Right.
Now, one thing to watch too is when you're mobilizing your ankle, you don't want the arch of your foot to change too much. Okay, what I mean by that is, if I'm mobilizing this ankle, okay, and I go into the squat, that's okay, where I'm going in and out of the end range of my ankle, but I don't want to see this. If your arch flattens out, it means you've already taken up all the slack in your ankle, and now you're cheating by flattening out your foot. So your arches should stay pretty similar. Yeah. As you oscillate in and out of that end range, arches should stay fairly similar from start to finish.
The way I look at it is like if you're staying relatively over your foot, you're good, because you can explore different ranges of your ankle. But like Nick said, you don't want your actual foot to change too much. Because over here, I can feel that I get quite a bit bigger of a stretch than over here, and that's all good. You're exposing it to kind of this window over your ankle, right? But that's where, if you think about when you're walking or anything, you want to be able to move right through your ankle. A lot of people have to skirt around their ankle because they don't have the ankle range, so it's going to affect their patterns, right? And you see that a lot when people are squatting in the gym too. You either see a couple things. It's either what Nick said is that the foot will flatten out if they don't have the ankles, or the feet will like spin out if they don't have the ankle range, right? Because they can't go right through their ankles. So final one I'm go over is this, called the modified pistol test. So a lot of CrossFitters get stumped with this one. But if you're doing, this is not for everybody again, but I like to put people to the test because it shows you, do you have like a really good amount of ankle range? It's also one of my favorite ways to work on that end range ankle. So it's like a Cossack squat position. What we do is if you don't want to try this, that's fine too. Kind of put the heel out to the side here. This is the ankle being tested. Your toes are on the ground here. We're trying to keep our foot facing forward, right? So what we do here is we're going to slowly push back. And as we push back, you're going to use your hands to slowly lower you down as much as you need. And you're going to keep your arch and you're going to keep your foot straight. You're going to see if you can slowly lower to the point where you can touch down on the ground and stay balanced here with your arch still there, right? And your foot preventing it from spinning out to the side, etc. Right? So if you can do this, that's like you're in kind of a nice deep pistol position with this ankle. Now, for people who are close, some people fall right on their ass right away. People who are close, I will often give them a little anchor here, so a heavier kettlebell. And what you can do is kind of rock back into that position. You have a counterbalance. So now it's like if I only have like a half inch to go, I can use this counterbalance and I can kind of just ease in and out. And I'll kind of lower, just touch, and I'm using this a little bit back up to the point where I can actually just kind of go there, and I'm still using this a little bit. And that allows me to do these things like like reach and just kind of find that end range ankle, spend some time there. I'm feeling a big stretch through there.
So
this
ends up
is
being,
this is a little way to make it a little bit easier on you. And then it turns into a really good position. Once we don't need this anymore, get rid of it and see if you can stabilize. See if you can do those reaches again, things like that, drive those toes in, same type of principles there.
So what's the different factor between that and the, parallel squat? Because like I could parallel squat for days,
but that's hard. So yeah, I find this it just really highlights the ankle that much more.
It can be groin too. If your groin's tight, that can be a limiting factor. That's just a really good high-level screen. So if someone is a runner, when you run, your ankles are essentially your shock absorbers, right? If you have a lot of travel in the ankle, you have a lot of ability to absorb impact and recycle energy. So if someone's a runner, if someone's doing CrossFit and they're doing hundreds of pistol squats a week, they should be able to demonstrate they can do that, right? And most of them are doing pistols and can't do that. And they're wondering why their knee's killing them or why their hip's pinching. So it's a good high-level screen, not for everyone, right? For a lot of people, just a barefoot bodyweight hip-width apart squat, that's a good screen.
For sure.
And it lets you check back, okay, I just worked on my ankles every day for 10 minutes, I got rid of the heeled footwear, I'm gonna check my squat once a week every week and see if it's feeling more comfortable or more, or easier to be in that position. If it is, it's confirming that the ankle mobility work you're doing is actually changing something. And that's important. You gotta be able to check yourself and see, is the time I'm investing working on my body actually giving me a change? That tends to be a good screen or a good checkup for a lot of people, or just a barefoot bodyweight squat. But it's important to find something to check yourself and see, is this actually changing what I'm trying to change?
I also have a question about
Yep.
like hypermobility.
Yes.
Because, do you offer any cues or anything? I did notice because that's kind of my situation.
Yep.
There's too much mobility.
Yes, that's a good question.
Like when I grip my toes, pull my toes up, I start to feel more tensioned and less just laxed in my foot and ankle. But I also feel like, especially in that last one we did, I have to like pull in at my hips, like add tension other places in order to get more into the
position.
I'm focusing on rather than just resting in it.
Yeah, and I mean, really having a joint that's overly mobile and having a joint that's stiff, they're both equally big problems, but they just require different solutions to kind of solve those issues. And so for someone that can do a barefoot bodyweight squat, like ankle mobility is only something you need to work on if you don't have enough of it. If you do, the biggest thing that people typically need to work on is hip stability, which trickles down to the ankle. So maybe your priority should be stability work instead of ankle mobility work.
But like you say, like sometimes if you want to bias your ankle, if you're hypermobile elsewhere, like you can get into some of these positions like a deep squat, and you might not even have the ankle range that you need too, right? So you can kind of, because like I can get here, and if you look at me from this side, it's like I'm not even using my ankles, right? But I'm so mobile through, somebody who's so mobile through the hips, it's like you don't even need to use that joint. So it depends what joint we're talking about. And sometimes it's not as simple as like, if you're generally hypermobile, that's one thing, but sometimes you'll see like gymnasts who have some specific restrictions. You're like, you can get in the splits in all directions, but do your ankles actually move? So it depends. But anyways, these are just positions, and if you can kind of work on them, gain stability there, like you say, if you can grip the ground and get strong there, the big way that you make it more permanent is by putting yourself there and like almost owning the position. That's why I like to pick up a weight and just, it forces your core to come on and just like really own the position so you won't fall over basically, right? Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question.
So a lot of people are limited in dorsiflexion, which when your foot's on the ground is bringing your knee over your foot. But a lot of people also get restricted in plantar flexion. Okay, and I think the big reason for that is because, if you run regularly and you wear cushioned footwear, it allows you to heel strike, to hit your heel on the ground first. And then every time you step down, every single stride you take, you have to use these shin muscles to lower your foot down eccentrically to the floor. Humans are not supposed to run that way, right? We're supposed to run with a forefoot strike so that our Achilles can absorb that impact. But if you run that way, this muscle, especially tib anterior, starts to get overloaded and tight. And that's where you get, compartment syndrome, shin splints, MTSS. This is really that whole umbrella of issues at the shin, and that anterior shin tension is really from running with poor mechanics. But a lot of times people have to reclaim and get the ability back to point their toes, to plantar flex. So the screen that we use for that, and even the position you can mobilize in, is ankles, or with your ankles pointed, can you sit back on your heels and be comfortable? If you can't, or it feels like your ankles are gonna blow up, it usually means you got a little bit of tension there, and you just work at it, right? And for people that this is too uncomfortable to even try, maybe they put a rolled up towel under their ankles, and then they kind of sit back, hold for a second, and then relax. sit back, hold for a second, relax. But a good thing to work towards being able to do is, can you sit down with your feet together and sit on your feet, sit on your heels and be okay. Okay, and if you can't, you just work at it.
To take to the next level too, you can even lift up
Hurt your knee.
like this. So once you do that, it'll really
usually
pry
quads.
that open too.
We'll talk about that when we get in the hips
So
there.
that gives a nice stretch to there. So that's the kind of the next level if you want a little bit more of it, right?
Okay. Yeah, trying to keep them flat. I mean, a little bit of angling out. Like if someone's got a really tight shin, even with their feet angling out, this is gonna suck. And that's just an indication like, okay, you got something to work on. But yeah, if you wanna be really nitpicky, trying to keep the feet straight, I try and put my feet directly together and my heels, keep my heels from kind of flopping out to the sides. And that can be, it's just a position, we like black and white positions that can act as screens. So if you can't do this, you got stuff to work on, right? It's black and white, everyone knows whether that's the case or not. And so yeah, and one thing you can do to release some of that tissue tension, right outside of your shin bone, the upper 2/3 of your shin, just outside your shin bone, there's a little pocket of tissue called tibialis anterior. Now beware, if you try this right now, it's probably not gonna feel very good because a lot of people are really tight there. The way to release that is literally just put your knee on the floor, get the ball just outside your shin bone. Okay, I like to do it, you can roll up and down, but the way I like to do it is I put my knee on the floor so I can adjust how much weight's going through there, and then I just pump my ankle back and forth, just like that. And that for a lot of people is gonna be super nasty, and if it's nasty, it means you gotta work on it. So ease off the pressure, so there's hardly any pressure. Pick a spot, pump your ankle about 4 or 5 times, go a little bit lower, pump your ankle 4 or 5 times, and just kind of do a bit of a cleanup there. And then if you wanna see whether that did anything, go back and do this after you've done it on one side and not the other. Oftentimes you'll feel a difference. Just after like 30 seconds or a minute of tissue work, just to kind of open up the muscle from the fascia and just kind of decrease some tone there. But that can be very helpful. So.
Sorry, was it on the inside or the outside?
Just on the outside of the shin. Yeah. Yeah, outside of the shin, upper 2/3 is this little strip of muscle. You can even push in there. It's tibialis anterior. It just gets overworked in a lot of people and can be a source of problems or pain there. Okay, but if long term you're always tight there, you might have to take a look at the mechanics of how you're moving, especially with running, to just, that's the root cause of the problem, right? You can do tissue work there every day if you want, but.
And walking's the same way, right? It's just a lot of people don't know how they're landing because of the shoes they're wearing. So it's that same landing mechanics that we'll talk about. We don't get into walking too much.
No, we don't get into walking.
So everyone can stand up. We're going to go through a few other things, more software related now. I'm going to run everybody through a little bit of something that I show somebody, especially somebody who comes in and say, I've had flat feet, or I have flat feet. So that's perfect. So I just like to show them this in the clinic and show them that you're in control of your arches, and oftentimes it's kind of an eye opener for people. So
because a lot of people have been told that they have flat feet, and it's like a sentence. It's like, you got flat feet, you're stuck with them, that's it. Or they think it's genetic, and it's like, well, your hips control your arch, and this is how we show them how that holds true. Exactly.
Basically, that's one of the principles that we like to get across to people, is that your body can change depending on what you do with it. So you can change it as much as you want. You can gain all the mobility back that you want. It's just a matter of working on it. So I don't think people understand how moldable and adaptable their bodies are, and it's extreme in some cases. You can take somebody who's been sitting in an office work environment for years, and like I had one patient, he got into yoga and he was able to do the splits 2 years later after being like as stiff as a board walking in. So it's like,
and he was like 70.
And he was 70. So yeah, you can change if you want. It's just a matter of like how much are you willing to change your body depending on the stresses you place on it. So what we're going to do is just look down at your feet basically. So this is just a simple little wake-up drill. The first thing I'll get people to do, and this is just to show you that you have the capacity, and we're working primarily on the hips and everything upstream of the feet, to place your feet where you want. Because, again, placing your foot is a key element in order to be able to use your foot and all those intrinsics, right? So it's everything in the foot's job to keep that place and keep that stability, but it's everything above it, hips, lower leg, that whole chain all the way up, to place it. So we're just going to think about pushing our knees to the sides, bringing them in, pushing our knees to the sides, bringing them in. I want you to keep your toes on the ground. But for a lot of people, just this simple fact of when you push your knees out, you can pull your arches up. a lot of times I'll just kind of get them going like that a few times, and they'll be like, oh yeah, so my foot changes when I try to push my knees out. Now what's pushing my knees out? It's my hips. So when I'm using my hips to push my knees out, my feet come along the way. So just explaining that this is a whole chain of events that's happening. And when I try to just push my knees out, feet are lifting up. Now oftentimes, after we've done that a few times, ideally what we want to coach them is being able to get to this neutral position. Because if I push out too far, you see I come up on the outer side, and if I go in, I'm coming up, I'm going into more of that flat-footed posture. So a lot of people, it's about that external rotation. They're not able to use their hips here to prevent unwanted internal rotation, because gravity wants to pull us to the floor every time, right? And that's why you see people in squats and things like that, knees caving in and stuff like that. That's just a microcosm of what's happening, right? So it can happen in movement patterns, or it can happen at rest. It can happen when we're balancing, right? So a lot of that is just coming from up here. So the next thing I'll go into is that once they've done that a few times, is forget about that. Just stand tall. Keep your toes on the ground. Try to stand tall and squeeze your bum as hard as you can. And then relax. Stand tall, squeeze your bum as hard as you can. Make sure you feel your bum squeezing. And let's just do this another 3 times. Stand tall, squeeze, let go. Stand tall, squeeze, and let go. Now you can look down at your feet when you do that. So stand tall, squeeze your bum, let your bum go. Squeeze your bum, let your bum go. And you'll see that there's that connection just from squeezing your bum, that your feet will almost kind of push out a little bit against the floor and pick up a little bit. So once you get that across to people, is like your bum is affecting things all the way down at the floor, right? So they're like, oh, wow, that's weird, right? So a lot of times it's just getting that buy-in. It's like, okay, so first of all, you just proved to me that you can change the position of your arches. We just need to get this a long-term strategy developed so you can actually, basically take advantage of this. And what are we doing here? So that's just kind of a little sample of what's going on. So for a lot of people happen to be very tight, stiff in the front of their hips from a lot of the sitting that we do, which we'll talk about more in the hip section. But what I'm doing when I squeeze my bum is I'm posteriorly tilting my pelvis, and that happens to wind everything up and create that external rotation. The opposite of that is where a lot of people are living, really kind of anterior tilted. So that does the opposite. When I anteriorly tilt, I go away from my glutes and things kind of collapse in, right? So just showing people that where your pelvis is in space determines what's happening at the floor, right? And it's really that pelvic position that we're worried about, because when we're standing, our glutes are kind of pelvic supporters. When I'm standing on the spot, there's a little bit of glute on, and that means my pelvis is kind of in that neutral position. If I've got no glute there, right, we kind of dump and it shows up at the floor, boom, right? So winding everything up or letting things go in is dependent on how we're using everything around that pelvis to put ourselves in a good position.
And that's kind of just a demonstration of your hips generating torque aligns your whole lower leg, your knee, your ankle, and down to your foot to generate that good arch position. Now, for a lot of people, that's hard work. Right? If your hips are really, really tight, they're not used to rotating, to constantly generate or consciously generate torque and rotate is actually hard. People find it difficult. It's like, okay, now all we have to do is open up some slack in your hip joint so that you can do that without as much effort, and so that it eventually becomes reflexive, right? Because we don't want everyone to think, okay, wind the feet up every single time they want to generate a stable position. You want the stable position to be your default, but you have to train it consciously and find out what you got to work on so that you have the room there, and your brain can eventually just do that on its own. That's the goal, is for the feet to be reflexive and not always have to think exactly of what your feet are doing. But for people that think they're born with flat feet and they're doomed to having flat feet forever, that's a really nice way to demonstrate to them, hip width apart, feet straight, barefoot, bend the knee slightly and push the knees out to the outside to show them that their hips create their arch. So the hip positions the arch. Now, the one we're going to talk about next is called short foot, and this is where you can use the muscles, the intrinsic muscles of the foot. So the muscles that start and end within the foot itself, the foot core, like we like to call it. Once your hips have positioned your foot, now you can use the muscles of your foot to hold the foot in a nice stable position. Okay? So it's like flexing your foot muscles. So we're going to talk about that next. Now, before we even, the main cue that we use in the clinic is tripod. And the whole point of a cue is to take 5 different things and package them into one word so that when you say that one word, people realize and think of those 5 other things instead of saying 5 different things. So when we say tripod, typically what we're talking about, number 1 is weight distribution of the foot. Okay, you want it 50-50, we call it 50-50, 50-50. Okay, so 50-50 front and back, okay, and 50-50 side to side. So if you think of 3 points if you think of your foot as a tripod, there's 3 points. base of the big toe, base of the pinky toe, and your heel bone. Okay, you want equal weight from base of the big toe and your pinky toe, and equal weight from your forefoot to your hind foot. Okay, so making sure that you keep that tripod all the time. You see it all the time when people are doing a squat. Some people will try and create such torque at their hips that they'll actually lose that base of the big toe. So a lot of people do the opposite, where they kind of angle in and they lose that pinky toe. So they're putting more weight on the inside or more weight on the outside. If you always try and be mindful of putting equal weight laterally and front to back, you're always going to keep a fairly stable foot position. Okay, and a lot of that is determined by how much organization you're doing at your hip to put your foot in a good position. Now, once you've done that, so when we say tripod, people should think 50-50 weight distribution, organize the hips so that they're creating some arch, right? We're not talking about like as hard as you can, but you don't want to let things sag in. So find kind of the middle position where there's a bit of an arch. You've organized the bones of your foot. Your weight is distributed evenly. Now you're in a good position to contract what's called short foot. And it's called short foot because if you do it correctly, your foot will actually get a little bit shorter. Okay, it'll kind of cinch up.
Just something to note on that. That rule can guide you like in strength conditioning or whatever you're doing. Now, and it doesn't apply to when we're being dynamic. So a lot of people are like, every time I hit the ground when I'm walking, do I need to do that? And it's like, no, you don't need to do that. Our foot becomes very mobile when we hit the ground and it adapts to it, and then it becomes rigid. So that's a different story. But when we're on the ground, it can guide, for instance, if you look at a squat. That rule, I used to be, because I hear the cue all the time, like drive your knees out, because most people do need to work on driving their knees out in a squat, for instance, right? Because their glutes aren't doing their thing. But if you just always abide by that rule, and that's like your first and foremost rule, that's going to take care of everything else. It's going to guide you along the way, right? Because if you're losing your tripod at any point, well, something's not happening, right? So just guiding that. And oftentimes I can even take away like things like, sometimes I'll be a little stiff and I'll go and I'll be getting like a knee click when I'm squatting, for instance. And if I go back to like, am I really rooting that tripod like I should? And once I go back to that, it's like, oh, the knee click even went away. Things like that, right? So you're just getting yourself into the best position possible because your feet are indicative of everything upstream, and you're getting the most stability from your foot and the most out of your foot. So that's kind of how we're designed to use our feet when we're doing things like that, when we want stability on the ground. Right? Think about being pushed over. If somebody comes up to you and you're like, it's like, I'm going to try to push you over, you're going to try to find that position and you're going to try to root to the ground as best you can. You're not going to be standing like this, you're going to be pushed over, right? So, yeah.
So with short foot, once you've organized your foot in a good position, even weight distribution, now to contract those muscles, all you have to do, there's a couple different cues, and people call this different things, short foot, doming, like creating a suction cup under your foot. But essentially what you're doing is pushing your toes. Can you see how when I do this, my toes push into the floor, my foot gets a bit shorter, and then when I relax, my foot kind of splays out? So the cue for this, the thing that a lot of people do to screw this up is they actually curl their toes. You don't want your toenails to disappear, so you don't want your toes to curl, you just want your toes to push directly into the floor. Okay, so let's try that together. So the first thing you do is find the right position. So distribute the load evenly through your feet, play with your hip rotation to find a good arch position. Once you've found it and you have your weight distributed evenly, side to side and front to back. Now what I want you to do is push your toes into the floor.
And when he says toes, he means base of the toes too. So you like here and here, because that's going to prevent that curl from happening.
Okay, so push down, and I want you to hold for 5 seconds. Okay, so hold that contraction for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then relax. Okay, we're going to try that again, but this time when we try it, we're going to go from 2 legs and we're going to slowly shift to 1 leg, and I want you to try and keep that contraction the whole time as you shift. You're doubling the weight on that foot. So some people's feet might cramp, some people might not be able to hold it, and they might kind of collapse down, but try as best you can to hold it, okay? So for both feet, organize the feet. The more you do this sequence of organize the feet, distribute load, now you're in a position to fire short foot, the more times you consciously run through that sequence, the easier it is for your brain to just do it on autopilot. But you got to consciously do it for a bunch of reps first. Okay, so organize the foot, distribute the load, contract short foot, so push your toes into the floor. Don't let the toenails disappear. Now I want you to very slowly shift over to stand on 1 leg. Okay, slowly, and try and balance there. And hold there for about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and relax. Okay, we're going to try the same thing on the other side now. Okay, so position your feet, distribute the load evenly, play with your hips to put your foot in a good position, contract short foot, so fire those muscles. Now I want you to very slowly shift over towards the other side. Okay, once you're on 1 foot, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then relax. Okay, so when you relax, you should see your foot almost like splay out and fan out, almost like a puddle expanding. Okay, now we don't expect everyone to be masters of this right now, right? But we just want to give people an idea of what you can do with your feet. And some people might literally need to spend time barefoot and open up their foot with a lacrosse ball a bunch before they even get access to the muscles that create that tension, that suction cup effect. But working on, the beauty about that is you can work on that anywhere, right? If you're wearing shoes that don't smush your feet, when you're in the lineup for the grocery store, you can work on doming or short foot. You can work on it anywhere. When you're doing dishes, you can work on that, right? And the more times you work on it, the more you're getting the ability to fire those muscles at will kind of back into the repertoire of your brain, right? Because a lot of people just don't know how to do that. That's one of the biggest things I do. If my feet start to get cold, all I do is flex my feet a bunch, and then blood flow goes into my foot, and my feet don't get as cold anymore. That's what people don't realize, is getting really, really cold feet is less about having to cover them with a bunch of layers and more about how about you get the muscles doing their job again so that fresh blood flow delivering heat goes back into them. And it's surprising how your feet really don't get cold once your feet actually become functional.
Is that how you did, it was the poster with the snow?
Yeah. Well, I did an experiment with my girlfriend. She always complains that her feet get cold. I went out on a hike in winter in snow, and instead of wearing these big beefy boots that she always wears and whines that her feet get cold in, I got her to wear Vibrams, which are basically like a thin layer of material over her foot. She's like, "You're crazy, my feet are gonna freeze off." She didn't complain about, she said her feet got a bit cold, but not anywhere close to these big clunky insulated boots, which didn't allow any motion of her foot, supported the arch of her foot, they compressed her foot, so it literally stopped the blood flow from going into her feet. It didn't matter if there was like 18 layers of insulation, there's no blood to deliver heat. So of course your feet are gonna get cold, right? But being able to move and articulate and use the muscles of your foot, and in fact being forced to because there's no support there, made it so that her feet didn't get as cold. And it was counterintuitive. It's like less insulation, my feet didn't get cold, what's going on? And it was just the muscles actually did their job, so there was blood flow delivering heat. So it's just one of those weird things. We living, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you wear, I mean, performance footwear used for a purpose, there's always kind of a trade-off, right? Yeah. You can't have a ski boot that lets your foot act like it's barefoot because it's not normal for humans to go down a hill on 2 planks of wood. But at the same time, you can usually find a mid-ground, right? If you're a high-performance skier, you got to have a super tight ski boot. Otherwise, you're not going to have responsive skis. But for the average skier, they can probably go to a wider last, and it's going to make their feet a lot more comfortable without losing a huge amount of responsiveness or performance. So it's just
one thing to note too, like what's interesting is as you use your feet more and more, anything you do, they're going to be working for you harder and harder, which again, it's super weird. I went snowboarding with my friends, and I never noticed this. It was my first time out since really training my feet, and my feet were the limiting factor. Like as I was turning, going downhill, I had to stop because my feet were like cramping up, and I work on my feet really hard. So I asked my friends, like, do you feel your feet? Like, and they're like, no, nothing's going on my feet. Like, really, that's weird. Like, that's the main thing I'm feeling. And then like they're the ones who don't know how to use their feet, so basically they're using like an ankle strategy. So they're just they're going through the ankle, but their feet are just kind of going along for the ride there, right? But as you do it more, you get more. Like same thing with the surfing. I've been out surfing a few times since really having more strong functional feet, and it's just like the grip you can get. They're going to be working harder, back to that principle, but they're going to give you more performance when they are working harder, as opposed to being these like passive passengers along the way. So short foot should be not only like you want to be mindful of it when you need it, but also it should be reflexive. That's the end goal with it. So if you're thinking about like cutting and pivoting, it should happen right away. If I'm trying to like plant, that's where I need to like grip the ground, and the better you are, that's also like preventative in terms of injuries. If your feet are sleepy as well, you're relying on other things like ankle and stuff like that. But you want to really grip and stabilize.
Okay, let's talk about hip. Any questions about feet? So hardware, open up the hardware, get the joints moving, reset the muscles, and then start to consciously activate those muscles so that they can play a little bit more of a role, right?
On the dorsiflex stretch, my right ankle just like stops. It feels like it's wedged or.
Okay. Where do you feel at the back of the ankle, or do you feel a pinch at the front? Okay, so a lot of times, so your ankle essentially, this is the main ankle bone called the talus. This is your distal tib fib. This is what your ankle joint looks like. Okay, now if that gap in space between here and the top of this, where the cartilage is, you need a gap there for it to be able to clear that bone. If you don't, or things are really stuck together, you can pinch or impinge, and that's where you get that hard block that you don't want to constantly push into that because a lot of times it's uncomfortable and the joint is not articulating like it should. So a few things to do there. Number one, we get people to, any muscle technically that crosses that joint and has tension in it can create a decrease in that space. So opening up the shin, opening up the calf, and then I often will get people doing like 5 minutes on a balance beam, and then I'll get them to try it again. And sometimes that can be the difference between going from a pinch or impingement to now feeling the tension at the back, like calf, Achilles area. If that still doesn't do it, that's where working with a therapist to do manual stuff where they can kind of like mold the joint to get back to articulating like it's supposed to, or doing banded mobilizations can help. But a lot of times people just had to put in a little bit of time releasing their calf tissue, releasing their shin, working on hip stability a little bit to get rid of why the calf is always tight rather. And then that helps quite a bit. So, but that's a good point. If going in and out of that ankle mobilization and a dorsiflexion gives you a pinch in the front each time, you have other work to do before you want to work into that mobilization, because you don't want to constantly go into that pinch. So, cool. You're welcome.
So
yeah,
hips.
you're not alone. That's a lot of people. So many people's ankles are locked up. It's crazy. And when we talk about the hips, like if your hip doesn't extend, you cannot use terminal ankle dorsiflexion. So they're very tightly connected. Like it's very hard to work on just dorsiflexion or just hip extension without working on the other, because one of those dictates how much you can use of the other, right? So if the front of my hip is tight and I can't extend my hip, I can't get my femur behind my pelvis, then I can't put my foot in a position of dorsiflexion, right? If this is end stage of walking, but my hip doesn't extend, I cut my stride off there, and I never actually get to here with my ankle. So the day-to-day stuff of taking away positive heels from your footwear and the part that we're going to get into next, opening up hip extension, those two things play a massive role in helping dorsiflexion as well. So, cyclers?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, cycling.
Yeah, that's a
the
tricky
big
one.
thing, because
I mean, it ends up just being a position you have to offset, just like the time that you have to sit in chairs. Because we're going to talk about, let's even start talking about sitting, because sitting is really the protect part about hips. Before we even get into the mobilizations to correct your hip mobility, the protect part is, okay, sitting in one static position for long periods of time, especially the chair position, wreaks havoc on our bodies, okay? But it's not just a matter of saying, well, sitting sucks, so don't sit, because that's not feasible for a lot of people, right? I don't know of a car you can stand in while you're driving. Some people have to sit in certain occasions at work. So the easiest way to do it is divide sitting into two categories. You have optional sitting, which is sitting that you have the option to do. So this is, sitting on the couch watching Netflix at the end of the day. That's optional sitting, because you can use a different position. A lot of people don't think that sitting at work is optional, but it is, because your boss, your employer can't force you to sit in a chair. You might have to make your own standing workstation, but that ends up being optional long term. So taking the optional sitting and modifying, instead of sitting in a chair, finding different ways to take a break from gravity. So sitting on the floor on a yoga mat, you automatically cannot sit in hip and knee 90-degree position. So you have to, some people here are sitting, but no one's sitting like you'd sit in a chair, right? And if you can turn that sitting time, so for example, 2 hours on the couch every day, if you take the couch away, put a yoga mat down, sit on the floor, some of the positions we're going to go through to mobilize your hips can be resting positions to just sit on the floor, right?
Floor creates hip mobility. Like, it's
Yeah.
as simple as that. So
True.
it's just the environment dictates, how your body is, basically. So again, something as simple as that will allow you to just explore, and you'll see that in a second.
And then the non-optional sitting, so sitting you have no choice but to do. To offset that, the first mobilization we're going to do is for hip extension. And one of the things that's working well for our patients is for every 1 hour of sitting in a chair, you got to do 1 minute of hip extension mobility per hip. Okay? So that ends up giving you some sort of way to, okay, I have no choice but to sit for these 3 hours. At least I know that if I do this stuff at the end of the day, I'll offset some of the negative effects from the time I spent sitting and prevent myself from constantly getting tighter and tighter and tighter. Because sitting is, saying sitting is the enemy is kind of like, it's like saying salt is bad for you. Salt's actually good for you in small doses, but if you eat a pound of it, you're dead. Sitting is not a bad thing to do. It's taking a break from gravity, and you can do it in chairs sometimes, but if you do it 10 hours a day, it's going to literally mess up how you move. And then people are like, oh, I don't know why my knees hurt. It's like, well, your hips have gotten tight over the last 10 years, and now your knees are saying they can't do the job of your hips anymore, so they hurt.
We like to give people positions and say, like, regardless of what you do with your body, can you maintain these positions over time? So then it's like, yeah, if I'm sitting more all day long, it's going to be harder to maintain these positions. But as long as you can maintain them, that's where the end goal is. So it's the mobility. When we're talking about hips, a quick brief anatomy, ball and socket joints, a lot of potential mobility, rotation, flexion, extension is when we go behind us. That's where a lot of people are limited. If you watching people walk down the street, Oftentimes you'll see this thigh bone is not traveling behind them when they're walking. So they're walking with more of their knee strategy, right, as opposed to actually following through. And that's where our glute works, is when we follow through when we're walking. So something as simple as walking can turn into a good way to open your hips up, and it can be a little checklist. It's like, can I actually extend my hips? Can I feel my glute when I'm walking? If the answer is yes, then that's good. You're using your hip extension as you're walking. So, but the thing is, a lot of people, when you cue them and they're just like, oh, I've never felt my butt when I'm walking, or I did not know that you're supposed to walk like that. And it's like, if we get over our body's way, you'll be able to demonstrate more of this. A lot of times the restriction that people have in the front of their hip, tight hip flexors, tight quads and all of that's preventing them from actually extending, so they use a different strategy, right? And they don't. And that's kind of the body's way of working and compensating. If you can't move through a hardware roadblock, you're just going to compensate some way else. But that's not the most efficient way, and oftentimes it leads to them developing really tight hamstrings and calves because they're using their knees and their ankle a lot more to push them through when they're walking. So the hips are important just to essentially remove the roadblocks to being able to demonstrate patterns. The squat's another one. If you can't get into squat, a lot of times it's ankles, but also hips. So it gives us more freedom, but it also gives us more ball and socket freedom to explore these different positions and maintain a good foot position. So the more freedom of motion I have in my hips, the more I can demonstrate balance and stability. Something that we do in our seminar is show people that what we like to do is get people to establish hip dominance. So mobility is the hardware. Software is being able to use your hips and feel your hips. When you're walking, like I talked about, when you're bending over, can you do something like a hinge, right? Can you sit into your hips? Can you use your hips in different positions, right? And this is all really important in terms of maintaining position downstream. So, like I said, something like balance too. If I'm on a beam, me using my hips allows me to maintain a nice neutral position down here and maintain my balance if I can use my hips. People who really stiffen their hips, they'll be very wobbly and they can't kind of rely on these hips. They can't sit into these deep positions and bring themselves back. So it translates into a lot of things, from walking all the way up to like balancing, squatting, all of that. So ball and socket joint, lots of potential mobility. We're going to work on 3 ways to start getting back those areas of mobility, key areas. And
yeah, we're going to start with
hips allow you to position everything downstream of them. So the more mobility you have, the more potential you have to maintain a good position downstream. And then again, just remember, it's hardware, software. A lot of people have to do kind of both, right? They have kind of sleepy hips. You have to learn how to use them, and that's where a lot of us in the clinic, we have to coach people on just being able to hinge and use them and utilize them and just wake them up again. It's like the feet. Just the same thing that we have to do with our feet and kind of wake them up, we have to do it with our hips, right?
So we find it's most effective to couple hardware and software together, right? So software is kind of what you do to hit control save on the mobility work you just did, right? So if you open up 10 degrees of extension at your hip, you better make sure that your brain knows how to fire the muscles to stabilize in that position, or else that increased mobility without control is actually a threat and it gets taken right back from you. So each of these mobilizations we're going to work on, the main functions of your glute is to extend the hip, externally rotate, and abduct. Okay, do this motion. So the 3 mobilizations that we teach is 1 for extension, 1 for rotation, and 1 for abduction. And so we're going to go through those right now, and each mobilization is going to have a corresponding kind of software repatterning motion with it. Okay, so for the first one, let's get everyone to grab a couple of those little pads.
One thing we're going to do, as you'll see, we're going to eliminate joints to work on our hips so we can bias our hips, and then we're going to bring the joints back in by standing on our feet and using our hips the same manner.
So this is the sitting offset. This is the one that we're having a lot of luck with patients being able to do to offset the sitting that they do in chairs. Okay, now this is a stretch that you see done a lot. You also see done improperly a lot. Okay, this is how you most usually see it done. Oh, my hip's so flexible, this is awesome. A lot of times, a lot of that mobility is coming from their low back, right? So when I go here, I've gone way past my hip extension and I'm arching my lumbar spine. It looks like I have really good hip extension, but it's really just spine extension. So the way that we correct that, you're kneeling down on one leg, the other leg's out to the outside. Think of this leg like a tripod. I don't care where it goes. Don't have it right in front because then you get kind of wobbly, so it's just to give you balance. The first thing you do is check your alignment. So knee, hip, shoulder, one straight line. Okay, so you want to start with everything aligned and stacked. The next thing you do is squeeze your butt cheek. Okay, if by squeezing your butt cheek you feel a stretch already in the front of your hip, you just got to the limit of your hip extension. So that's really all you have to do. Eventually you're not going to be able to, eventually you won't feel that tension when you start to open things up. So what you then have to do is butt squeezed. I'm going to pretend like there's a string at the front of my hip. I keep my knee and my shoulder in the same spot and I pull that string forward. Okay, so you go until you feel a good amount of like comfortable tension at the front of your hip, and then you relax. Okay, so it's oscillating. It's very small little pulses. There's different ways of doing this. You can do higher threshold stuff where you got 2 poles, you're driving into the ground, firing your core really, really hard, and doing longer sustained holds. And you can get a lot more from that. Problem is, you got to have really good awareness of your spine position, because if you keep pushing and eventually you lose the core and you start to bend your back or let your back arch, then you lose the stretch. So for a lot of people, it's just squeeze the bum, push forward, hold for a second, relax. Squeeze, relax.
That preventing leaning back is the biggest key too. I find I often have to go back to the core because people will kind of squeeze, but they'll kind of lean, right? Squeeze and lean. And that's just a demonstration of what's happening when we're walking too. So again, we're eliminating joints. This is by just going in and out and squeezing, letting go. That's like you're walking along. So it's like I'm striding, letting go, striding, letting go, right? So picture it as that, because when I'm on my feet, that's when I'm striding, my glutes coming on. So we're practicing not only, it is a stretch, but it's more of it's a glute activation exercise. It's a practicing using your hips to extend your hips so that we can then layer it into things that matter more, like walking. So
when we talk about sitting offset, 1 minute per hip per hour of sitting, we're talking about a minute of going in and out of tension, second on, second off. So you get about 30 reps done in a minute. So if I sat for 4 hours during the course of a day, at some point that day, I'm going to want to do 4 sets of 1 minute per side. And oftentimes it's easy to do it in 1 minute batches. So you do a minute here where it's like, on, off, on, off. Do that for 60 seconds. Switch, and let's all actually switch over to the other side.
Staying in flexion. Your ankle.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to put the back ankle so that the toes are up, because it puts my big toe in extension, puts my ankle in dorsiflexion, and both those positions correspond to hip extension. It's all kind of part of the same motor pattern when we walk. So same thing, squeeze the bum, push forward, hold for a sec, comfortable tension. Okay, I don't want you to go forward until you feel like your hip's gonna explode. Just go to the point where you're like, okay, I feel tightness there, I've hit the end of my range, and then I relax. And by doing that repetitively, it's like the ankle. Go to end range, relax. Go to end range, relax. The more times you're hitting end range, especially with a glute contraction, with your core on, ribs down, pushing into that, you're gonna end up increasing and improving and opening up more and more hip extension. Okay, especially if you're doing it directly to offset your sitting. So,
note which glute too. Like people often say in clinic, like, oh, one side I can't even squeeze at all. The other side is right there for me. So that's something to note, because that's just showing you what's happening. Again, layering it into other things like walking. But if you can even them out over time and just go for the same experience so we can get the same contraction of the glute on both sides and the same feeling of stretch, that's a good thing.
Now, a way to bias the quad, some people have really tight quads. If you want to bias your quad, with the shin flat, parallel to the floor, you're biasing the front of your hip. Okay? And where, as a little side note, we don't get too much into tissue work, but if you wanted to speed up troubleshooting, opening up your hip extension, a bit of tissue work can help. And the way that I like to do that is I'll do a set of this, and I'll feel, okay, where do I feel the tension today? I feel it obliquely, so that's probably TFL. And what I'll do is I'll do this for a minute, and then I'll take like a softball or a tissue work ball, and I'll roll out that area for 30 seconds or a minute. Okay, do a little bit of light tissue work in there. It's not like a big, long session. It's just enough to basically tell my brain to relax that muscle. It can happen in the course of like 60 seconds. Then I'll go back and do another set, and oftentimes I'll feel the tension somewhere different. So your hip's kind of like layers of an onion. Okay, you got skin, fascia, a bunch of different muscle layers, and then you got your hip joint way at the bottom. The goal is to work on your hip extension, but troubleshoot the tissues by doing tissue work to eliminate this layer, then this layer, and eventually you're just left with the joint. You just got to work on mobilizing that joint. Okay? If you feel in your, TFL, so tensofascial lata goes right into IT band. I tell people like TFL is the one that you should always be targeting, because IT band is just an inert layer of fascia. You can separate that from your quad and kind of work on that. But TFL, this little guy right here obliquely, a lot of people will feel it in rec fem, so directly in front of their quad. And if it's primarily in the quads that you feel it, if you want to bias your quad in that stretch, what you can do is just bend your knee. So you bring your heel up. Maybe it's not all the way to your bum.
Using something to put under,
or so something here. Like a lot of people will put a foam roll there so that they're bending like that. But essentially, if you can bring your leg up, you still have to be able to squeeze your bum. If you do this and you can no longer squeeze your bum, it means your quads have already pulled your pelvis this way and you can't access your glute. So you always have to be able to squeeze the bum. If you can't, you've gone too far into the stretch. Okay, but that's just another way to kind of bias a different area. So that's the hip extension one. It's fairly simple. Let's do a set of 30 per side right now together. So 1 minute per side. Then we're going to stand up and do high knee holds, which is the software to layer onto that new hip extension. Okay? So pick whatever knee you want. Okay, just at your own pace. I'm just going to time for a minute, And all I want you to do is pulsate on, relax, okay? Go for it. Just at your own pace, second on, second off. Okay, now if you get a really zinging sensation down your leg, some of that can be neural tension. Okay, you got this femoral nerve that goes down the front. If everything's stuck together, the muscles and the skin and the fascia is all stuck and kind of matted down together, maybe you got to do a little bit of foam rolling there. A lot of people are foam rolling, okay, but they're foam rolling as a solution, not as part of the kind of, not as a tool to use as part of like a global plan of mobility work. And this really, we found this to be very powerful. And the other thing that's powerful about this, if you do a minute per hip for every hour you spend sitting in chairs, it forces people to acknowledge how much time they're actually spending sitting in chairs. Okay, because when I ask someone in clinic, how much time do you think you spend in chairs every day? Whatever they say, I multiply by 2.5 and I'm usually still under. Because people underestimate, they don't think of meals as sitting in chairs. They don't think of driving as sitting in chairs. Sitting on the couch at the end of the day, watching sports in the morning. They seem to only think of sitting as sitting they do at work. And they really just kind of underestimate how much they do. So switch sides. Same thing on this side, a minute, just little pulses. The glute is very important, okay? It does a couple things. Number one, it stops your pelvis from dipping forward. Number two, if you squeeze your bum, you're actually going to inhibit some of the anterior hip tissues, okay? So the body has this thing called reciprocal inhibition. One muscle fires, the opposing muscle relaxes. It stops all our muscles from firing all at once. So it's this very deeply ingrained reflex. If you squeeze your bum, you're going to inhibit some tension in the front of your hip, so it allows you to work a little bit deeper into it, okay? Another 40 seconds, and then we're going to do some high knee holds. And you wouldn't think that standing on one leg and lifting your other leg up is hard, but it'll be difficult. So just little pulses, on, off, on, off. Like I said, the more core, the higher threshold you're firing your core with, the longer holds you can do. So some people will do like, fire this at 100% so that they're literally shaking, and they'll hold it for 10 seconds and really, really push into hip extension. But you can only do that if you're really tight here and you have an awareness of what your pelvis is doing. Otherwise, you just push into low back extension. Okay? All right, let's get everyone standing up. So this is the software part. Now, I'll show it to you, and then we're all going to try a couple reps on each side together. So what it is, you're going to stand on one leg. Okay, now that we've already gone through short foot, I want you to think of pushing the toes into the ground a little bit. You're going to hold this leg. When I say go, you're going to let it go. Both hands to the outside. You're going to hold this position for 5 seconds. And what you're focusing on is squeeze this butt as hard as you can. If this knee bends, if when you're standing up this happens, you've gone past your hip extension. So this hip always stays extended. Your butt is squeezed, okay? And you're trying to lift this leg up as high as you can as you're doing this. But the focus is squeeze here and try and keep your balance, okay?
Same thing, rib cage down too, because a lot of people will go up and then they'll kind of lean back like that. So prevent that.
Is it abduction when you lift?
No, flexion. Directly straight up like this. And I want everyone to hold their leg up first. When I say go, you let it go, but try not to let that knee fall at all. Okay? Ready, go. So hold there, hold 5, 4, nice and hard, 3, 2, 2.5, 1, and relax. Okay, now if you did 2-3 reps of a minute and you opened up hip extension, you will feel your butt cheek light up on that side because it's trying to fire in a position it may have never had access to before. Okay, so just try that on your own and do like a good session and you'll see. Try the same thing on the other side. So lift the leg up. Okay, the leg you're standing on is straight, that butt cheek squeezed. When I say go, we let go. Ready, go. Keep it nice and high. Even try and lift this leg up a little bit higher. 5, 4, core on nice and tight. 3, 2, 1, relax. Okay? Doesn't matter what the foot's doing.
Typically dorsiflexion because that's what's coupled with that, but it doesn't really matter, yeah.
Yeah, so that's just a drill too, because when I'm here, I'm doing 2 things. I'm doing terminal hip flexion, but in relative terms, this hip is extending, right? Because if I keep going here, eventually I'm going to bend that hip, and that's the limit of my hip extension. So that's about as far as I can extend my hip, but by dissociating both hips, you're going to the limit of flexion, which people are strong about here. That's about it. When they're asked to go above that, because we never actually have to do that, we're so used to the chair position, but we are really weak everywhere else, it works on hip flexion and hip extension. We're doing it more for the extension side, but if after a couple reps of that kneeling hip stretch to open up hip extension, you do a couple reps of that, very powerful. Okay, any questions? All right, we're gonna get into rotation now.
So, all right, everyone can come down to the ground. We're gonna do a little bit of a 90-90 work. So This can be modified. We'll go through some modifications, some progressions and all that throughout. What the 90-90 is we're working primarily on hip rotation. So this front leg, I'm working on external rotation. What we're trying to do position-wise is get the thigh directly out front of us, knee bent to 90 degrees, 90 degrees at our hips here, and then another 90 degrees at the knee. So it doesn't have to be perfect. That's the ideal position. Now to modify this, some people I have to actually get them to bend their knee up a little bit here. It makes it a little bit easier at first. We can do the same with the back leg. Bend it up a little bit and makes it a little bit easier. But if you can get to this 90-90 position, that's square one. Now, often test, can you be upright in this position here without falling over? What most people are like at the start is kind of out to the side like that. They can't get over into their hips. So what we do at the start is use this hand as a kickstand to push us more into the middle here. That just feels like you're bunched up there. That's just because, yeah, it's a mobility thing. You're not used to being there, but
you can bend your knee a little bit.
You can bend your knee a little bit. That's not
really interesting. Okay.
What are you feeling?
I don't know. It's just like kind of sharp pain.
Okay, so if you get a sharp pain, oftentimes it's not comfortable, but oftentimes that means we're just not used to being here. If it's like sharp pain, I wouldn't recommend kind of pushing through it.
Just try and modify it. So move your leg forward or back. Find a position where you don't get that sharp pain. And here's the thing with 90-90, a true 90-90 is straight forward 90, straight out to the side 90. For a lot of people, that sucks, right? They're either here or their hip cramps up. So the key at the start, and if your knee's up like this, better to bend your knee and let your knee go down than to put torque on your knee. So at the start, you know, if you're using this as your like TV position, modify, bend your knees, reorient your legs. Doesn't have to be a perfect 90-90. Just get yourself into a position that's not easy, but it's not painful, uncomfortable, pinchy. And that's kind of where you work or where you hang out for now. And as you open up your hip mobility, like if your groin is tight and you're missing internal rotation on the right side, it's going to jam your hip joint. That's where you get the pinch from. So it just requires a little bit of time and effort and work, and you'll find it's very different.
But the end goal position is this. So if you can get to, basically the goal is get to this and then just keep it. So that's as simple. And with a lot of the things, that's where it is. Here's the position you desire to attain. We can't get there now, so we modify it as needed to the point where we can get it and then just keep it. And if you keep this over time, you're not going to lose your hip rotation. Because if you just get in here every day, it's like, okay, we're good. We're not going to wake up one day and not be able to do it. So yeah, do what you need to do. So let's actually go back to that position. Do what you need to do to modify it. If you can get into a 90-90, we're going to use this hand as a kickstand at first. So we're going to push ourselves to as upright as we can. So we want to get tall through the spine here, and we don't want to be kind of rounded over through the back. Get as tall as you can, and what we're going to do first is you can actually just grab onto your ankle, and we'll just do a little bit of leaning in. So we're just going to kind of tilt in. We can tilt at different angles. So we can go kind of right towards the knee, belly button to knee, belly button to shin, somewhere in the middle there, and just kind of feel it out. You should ideally feel a glute stretch on that front hip, and then belly button in towards the ankle a little bit more. You'll get more of a capsule stretch there. Doesn't really matter. Essentially, you're just trying to explore different angles. Stay tall through the spine as you do this. Now, if you're not getting, some people don't feel that glute stretch. They need a little bit more of an external cue. So what you can do is take this front hand and reach it forward. So as you reach forward and try to touch something in front of us, we're driving more of that stretch. You should feel it right in the glute as you try to reach. You can pick different angles too. So you can reach over your knee, reach over your shin, reach over your ankle. So let's try that out. Reach at different angles. Try one of each. And as you really try to get as deep as you can, trying to touch that thing that's just out of your reach, you're going to feel a nice big stretch in there. Pick different angles. We'll go over the shin.
When you come back up, try and basically push your body back up by driving your front knee into the floor. So instead of just using your back muscles to pull you up, push that knee into the floor like you're trying to go through the floor, and it will use your glutes to pull your torso back up.
So it's eccentric, the glutes kind of loading up, and then it's concentric, pushing us back up. So basically, that's a nice way to start kind of semi-actively working into this position. We can take it fully active after that. So if you think about getting back into the position, if you can, getting upright, I like to make fists. And what we're trying to do here, we can pick the same three angles if we want. I typically like to stay kind of square going right down the center in this one, but you can play around a little bit with that. And what we're trying to do here is just reach in with our fists and load that glute up actively, trying to get as deep as we can without falling over, pausing, and then pushing ourselves back up from there, right? So a lot of people will get down and they'll kind of roll out to the side, and oftentimes I'll I'll get them to go back to square one and say, okay, only go as far as you can get without tilting and rolling off the side, because then we just kind of lost that loaded stretch that we're trying to attain. So you can, let's do a couple more reps here, and we'll just reach in as far as you can, stay as square as you can, take your time, even take 5-10 seconds to reach in. And again, you can turn it into an external cue where you're reaching and trying to touch something. Once you're at your limit, push yourself back out, back to neutral. We'll try one last time. Reach in, and push yourself back up to neutral. Now to spice it up even a little bit more, we're going to incorporate this back leg, and let's just do a couple reps of this. So we'll pick that middle reach right over the shin. We're going to reach in and we're going to internally rotate this backside. So watch what I do. As I reach in, I'm trying to lift this back leg up, and I'm reaching. Right. And I'm finding where my limit is, and then I'm pulling back out of it. So let's do 2 of those, and we'll hit the other side.
Now, even if you just try and lift your ankle, if it doesn't lift up off the ground, that's okay. But just if you're making an effort to do it, you're firing muscles that internally rotate your hip. Like, this is active mobility work. So this is not like, you know, simple, easy, fun stretching. This is using muscles to actively control yourself and pull yourself into a new range of mobility. So it's, you know, you get way quicker and better results with it, but it's also sucks. It's like work. It's a workout, basically. You can get sweating and huffing and puffing just doing positional work. You know, this is stuff like Andrea Spino and FRC, functional range conditioning, kin stretch. Very, very good stuff. I think it's hard for a lot of people to do it for an hour, but I think more people can do small doses of it, like, for example, this 90-90. And if right now, like 90-90, even just being able to kind of be here and chill and hang out without putting your hand on the ground, that's a screen. Because if right now you can't do that without cramping up or without modifying, but in a month from now you can, you change something, right? Your hip mobility improved because you just earned a position you didn't previously have. So that's another way to show yourself.
You can get more intense with it too. Oftentimes I'll grab a weight here, right? Just by holding a weight, I automatically need to own that position more, right? Because if I can't be on the verge of tipping over and hold a weight, right? And then I can think about going in actively and really loading that glute up. I'm getting a really nice active stretch there. And then I'm pushing myself out of that position there. So you can hold a weight, you can do different stuff with it, but it really is trying to, first of all, attain the position. Second of all, it's trying to strengthen and really ingrain the position. And then third of all, just make sure you keep it over time. And then, like I said, use it as that screen. Let's go to the other hip, actually. And we'll do a little bit of passive work first. Again, try to get to that position. Note which hip feels different or tighter.
Yes.
Typically, your dominant side leg will be harder to do in this. And not all the time, but most of the time, because it's a little bit tighter. So that's, for me, I have more trouble on this side. I can get nice and upright, but it's just harder work for me. So let's just kind of ankle on, hand on ankle at first, and we'll just try to lean in, do some of the passive stretching, hit different angles. Belly button to knee, belly button to shin, belly button to ankle, and just feel it out. Sometimes you'll feel not much going on. Some angles you feel like, oh, there's a real big glute stretch. So kind of just use that as your guide, what it feels like. Okay, so what we're gonna do now, we'll get a nice reach going. So pick this bottom hand up and reach for something in front of you. So pick 3 different angles on the floor, reach, 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 reach. As far as you possibly can. Push yourself out of it.
Literally reach for something. Stare at something that's beyond your reach and do everything you can to really reach for it. If you have an external cue that you're reaching for, you will go further and your brain will allow you to go further.
And last one.
Sounds weird, but it's legit.
Good. All right, if we can, let's do some active ones now. So get up as tall as you can. Make fists, reach those fists in. Try to square up as much as you can and stay tall through the spine. Load that glute up. And then push yourself out of it. You might get cramping in that back hip too as you do this. We'll do 3 reps of those, slightly different angles each.
Cramping's okay. Cramping means your brain's freaking out because the muscles are weak there or they've never been asked to go there. And that's one of the first things you notice goes away, because your brain stops acknowledging that position as a threat and freaking out with the muscles and is all of a sudden more comfortable going there if you've ingrained a little bit of control and strength in those positions. So it does go away, I promise. Because I used to not, even just going here, first couple times I got here, I would be like, ah, like it felt like someone shot me in my hip. And it's just through putting yourself here, like literally putting a yoga mat in front of your couch at home is one of the most productive ways to get more time in 90-90 because it's always there to remind you, right? And it's one of those things where like a lot of people just have to engineer their environment at home to eliminate the chance of failure. It's kind of like if you have chips in your house, you're probably going to eat them. If you never buy the chips, you never eat them. If the couch isn't there and all you have is a yoga mat, that's how you chill. That's how you sit down, right? And that's how you can turn 2 hours a day of hip mobility work into something that it doesn't even feel like you're taking extra time. You can still watch Netflix or whatever you want on TV. You just have to do it by putting your body in a different position that goes from detrimental to actually beneficial. So very powerful.
Do you guys suggest breathing through the cramp or stopping and addressing it?
I usually modify position because once your brain's decided it doesn't know that position, a lot of times I'll modify slightly and try and figure out how you're modifying so that you modify a little bit less each time.
But you want to go back to where you're cramping because that's where you need to actually go. It's telling you you're not comfortable here, so you need to develop comfort there.
I mean more like in the moment, because I had a guy
Yeah.
who was working my feet, my arch would cramp, and he'd
Yep.
say, let it cramp.
Yeah?
It's strength of that muscle is getting your brain awareness of
Did it work
Yeah.
for you? Did it work?
Seemed to, but
Okay.
Yeah, no, I like.
Hey, if you can breathe through it, if you can breathe out a cramp and kind of tolerate it, it's just, I've tried that and I basically just went into full-on
you
spasm
go-
and it was like, it hurt after, so.
It's almost like you touch in and
Yeah.
out of the cramp as opposed to going fully. Like you're talking about the cramps where you like seize up and you have to.
Yeah, where it's like you lock up, you're like, okay, I can breathe through this. Oh, no,
Because
I
even
can't.
here, it's like you'll feel the cramp come on and then off a little bit, on and off. That's what there. Yeah.
Okay, we gotta
Okay.
speed it up.
Was the goal for the 90-90 is for the knee to be
Yep. The goal is, yes, leg, thigh, straight in front, 90 degrees, thigh out to the side, 90 degrees, and be comfortable there. That's the goal. Now, if your knee's up off the ground, you're missing external rotation, I'd rather you bend the knee and let the knee go to the floor or put a yoga block or a towel there, because if the knee's off the ground, you're putting a good amount of shear force on the knee joint, just because you don't have the mobility here yet. So I'd rather you modify and bend as much as you need to, right? Like I think most people can go into something like this, be pretty comfortable. As you start to open up, you start to get more leverage put on the hip, and that's where you can get uncomfortable. So just modify just as much as you need to, but nothing, don't make the position too easy for yourself, basically.
Back hips not on the ground.
Nope, that back hip doesn't have to be on the ground. That's okay. Okay?
All right. So let's come up from there. We're just going to do a little bit of a rotational drill to ingrain that, and then we'll finish off our last hip mobilization. All this is, it's fairly simple. We're getting people to develop awareness of what it feels like to rotate. So we're basically going to stand on one leg and we're trying to rotate through a closed chain. This is the hip that's doing most of the work here, and we're rotating through a closed chain. All we're doing is trying to reach over and touch the ground as far as we can, while maintaining a nice tripod foot on the ground on that bottom leg. And then we're just going to open up the other way with our pelvis. And again, we want to maintain that tripod, so we don't want to have our knee and our foot come along the way. We want to try to keep that there and see how far we can go on this side, touch the ground, and develop a nice smooth rotation, right? So if you're rotating through a closed chain on this down hip, and you'll feel your hip going through all these different ranges of motion. Once you get out to the extremes, you might feel some cramping and stuff like that. Now we can also do this at different angles. So it turns a little bit harder if we go into more something like this. And this is called a hip airplane, where we open up like this, right? Trying to maintain a nice neutral foot down here. Bring it across this way, open up like this.
So it's all rotational control at his pelvis, right? A lot of people will do this and they'll just kind of go, oh yeah, this is so easy. But what you want is actually is not just your leg, but it's physically your pelvis. So sometimes I get people to put their hands on the front of their hips. Your pelvis should rotate one way and your pelvis should rotate the other way. This leg is like a statue. The knee doesn't cave in, the foot maintains an arch, which means you're probably not going to go as far. This is a very, very powerful exercise. It's just not done often because it's not very sexy. It's very boring. It's just control work, right? But what you're doing is, if you just worked on your 90-90 and opened up more rotation, now you want to teach your brain how to control that rotation with kind of your hip rotator cuff. And this is, whether it's just the standing ones or whether you do it like hip airplane style, you can start here is easiest, 10 degrees, 20 degrees. You can even do it in kind of 90-degree hinge and work on that, opening up your pelvis. It's all just that leg stays still and your pelvis is articulating and being controlled as it moves around that.
That's very common in sports like golf, even like closed chain rotation. You're having to to rotate into this hip, rotate through onto this side, right? So a lot of golfers run into low back issues because they can't rotate freely through their hips, so they have to kind of like crank through their backs here. It's the most common thing I see is knee pain or back pain for golfers, and it's because they can't use the middle ground hip, and they can't kind of produce that rotation. All right, so the final hip mobilization we're going to do is to open up into abduction. So we're going to work on the adductors, opening them up. Again, it's not so much about opening up specific muscles, it's developing a position. So that's the biggest thing we're going to be working on. We're going to tie in a little bit of an internal rotation with this too. So this is called a frog. We're going to get people down. Get your, basically, you want to get as wide as you can get. I like to go to my limit, but go to your comfortable limit. Don't go as far as you possibly can. Once you're there, then try to go down onto your forearms here like this. So all we're doing is some rocking at this point. So from this position, we're using your palms on the ground. Knees are as wide as you can. You can even slide them out a little bit more when you're down here. And then we're going to be pushing ourselves. So we're going to be pushing ourselves down into the hole. So once you push yourself backwards down into the hole, we're going to do a little bit of rocking there, gentle rocking, and you're going to feel that your groin stretching a little bit. We're going to pull and rock forward a little bit, and then we're going to go down to the bottom again. So the first, again, this is more passive. It's just see how it feels. Typically when you go down to the bottom, you're going to feel your groin a little bit more.
You want your hips to stay level with your shoulders?
Doesn't matter so much. You don't want to have, I'd bring your arms a little closer to you. And then you're going to push all the way backwards to the wall. Keep going backwards. Keep going back. So bring your elbows even closer to you. There we go. And then keep pushing backwards. Yeah, keep going. There we go. All the way down to the bottom. There we go. Good. So you're pushing as far as you can back, rocking a little bit, pulling yourself forward, and doing that a little bit. Now to take it more active, what we're going to do is we're going to pull forward where you started, kind of somewhere in the middle.
Bring your feet closer
Pretend you're in a hallway. You're in a hallway just wide enough to get your knees in. So your knees are touching that hallway. I want you to push into the walls on each side. Push the hallway like you're trying to break through with your knees. And as you try to push through that hallway and into that hallway, into those walls for 5 seconds, we're going to activate our glutes here. And we're going to strengthen into this position. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and relax. Now push down a little further into the hole again. And again, back to that hallway analogy. Push into those halls. Push into the walls for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You might even feel some shaking in your glutes. And we'll pull forward one more time and push into those walls in the hallway for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And relax. Now, stay down there if you can. If you need a break, you can come out of it. We're going to do some internal rotations to finish off. So what we're going to do is start to bring our hands a little bit forward, because when we pull ourselves forward here, I'm going to internally rotate one hip like this and pull this out as far as I can and hold for 3 to 5 seconds. Then I'm going to go back down to the hole again, and I'm going to do it on the other side. I'm going to pull forward, and I'm going to internally rotate this hip as far as I can. I'm going to hold it at my limit for 5 seconds. And then we're going to go down to the hole again. We'll do one of those per side, one more. Pull and internally rotate as much as you can. 3, 2, 1. Final one. Down to the hole, come up on the other side, internally rotate. 3, 2, 1. And just slowly make your way out of that position. There we go.
So it's not so much a passive groin stretch, it's an active mobilization to kind of work into being able to kind of get both legs going opposite directions, right? Because the main reason people can't do the splits is not because their muscles are physically stuck there, it's because their brain doesn't trust them to go into that position because it thinks their legs are going to rip apart, right? So you have to earn your brain's trust to get into these positions. And the reason this one's relevant is because we see it all the time. People try and go into a squat and their knees are stuck here because they can't go out here. Their brains don't acknowledge that as a safe position. And so this is convincing your brain that going into that position is safe so that you can generate torque in a squat and push your knees out to the outside so that you can go in and be stable there.
Especially those pushes in the hallway, that just is like, okay, we're okay. It's safety. You're ingraining safety and you're strengthening that position. And then, yeah, you can, like the squat would be a good way to layer it in. We're going to actually get everyone up and do side kicks. So that's another way to do it. So if everyone wants to stand up, essentially just like the last one, we're going to stand like this, and we're going to try to bring this leg up as high as we can on this side. And we can even lean into it a little bit, but we're in that same kind of wide groin position here. And as you do that, you're gonna feel your groin, your glute on this outside leg. You can even try to straighten your leg out a little bit there, and you'll really feel your glute light up, right? But we're just trying to get deep into position and hold it out there, and that's just more strengthening on our feet in that same manner. So again, we won't go through a bunch of them. Just know you can do it for time. You can do sets and reps of that, but it's something on your feet to just kind of ingrain what we worked on the ground. So when we're on the ground, we're isolating hips. Now we're ingraining it with our feet. And we're going back to the tripod rule, which we talked about. So when you're balancing on that foot, you want to maintain that as we do our thing.
Any questions about that? So that's each of the hip mobilizations paired up with some sort of active control to put you into the position you're mobilizing, but layer on some sort of muscular control to kind of hold you there and even strengthen into those positions. So they're not easy, and no one's going to be, it's hard to, you're not going to be an expert at it the first couple times you try it, but I think people need to really put their focus and motivation on progress and not perfection, okay? And don't compare yourself to others, because you've done different things with your body over the course of your life than other people, right? And the only thing that makes us be able to do some of these positions differently than you is because we've practiced them way more. That's it, right? So if you work on this, you will see consistent changes. And especially with the active control stuff, if you start, and all you can do is get to here, and if you try and go beyond that, your knee caves in, it just means you have mobility work to do here first. But if you start here, and then you're like, ooh, now I'm here, or now I'm here, and you see the fact that you're able to control and stabilize in higher and higher positions, same thing with the high knee holds. If you start here, but then you end up kind of here, you can see your improvement firsthand, and that's important. Because if you prove to yourself that what you're doing is working, and the time you're investing is actually giving you a result, no one has to hold your hand and push you along further. It's like that's all the motivation you need. And oftentimes when those things are happening, your pain's also decreasing, you're feeling better with your movements. Like, those are byproducts of having better mobility and better movement. But if you focus on just treating the pain, you don't fix the actual mobility or movement that causes the pain in the first place. So that's the approach here. Cool? So that covers hip, right? And this is like it's 2 hours, it's a crash course. It's one of those things where, we debated making the workshops longer, but at the end of the day, we wanted to see, can we give people tangible, actionable information in the course of 2 hours and clear up, okay, I have this problem, now I kind of know the easy stuff to work on. Protect, correct, develop. This mobilization stuff was the correct part. But if you modify your sitting, if you do 1 less hour of sitting in a chair and 20 minutes of hip mobility work every day, you will change big time if it's done consistently, right? Protect first. Wear good shoes, you don't have to mobilize your feet as much, because wearing shoes that let your foot function like they're barefoot is a foot mobilization and a foot strengthening exercise, just by being on your feet. Okay, and for a lot of people, feet get weak very easily because most people wear shoes that either support their arch or they're sitting and not fighting gravity. So none of that time are you loading the arch of your foot. So how would it be strong or able to support itself, right? So when you're first starting to go barefoot or wearing shoes without support and without cushioning, it takes time to condition your feet and get them working like they're supposed to again. So just be patient, right? Patience is the one element that few people have, and they want to offset 20 years or 2-3 decades worth of hip stiffness in 2 weeks, and if it's not gone in 2 weeks, they're pissed. It's like, well, it doesn't happen that way. But you will progress on a very predictable schedule if you're being consistent with the stuff. So the last 2 things that we want to touch on at the end here is footwear and orthotics. So, we often get people asking us, well, what shoe should I buy? What's the best shoe? It's like, well, that's the wrong question to be asking. What you should be asking is, what should I look for in shoes, so that you can make your own independent evaluation of every shoe that you go and buy. And if your only mission is every time I buy a pair of shoes, I buy a more functional shoe, not the perfect shoe, but if this one is more functional than the last one I bought, then you're going in the right direction. You don't have to throw out all your shoes and get all brand new shoe wardrobe. Now, what to look for in footwear. The 2 non-negotiable ones that you always want to have are flat. So if you look at a shoe from the side, the heel should not be higher than the forefoot. So get flat shoes and get footwear that has a wide forefoot. How wide do you need? Well, if you go barefoot beside the shoe and the shoe is a lot narrower than your foot, that shoe is too narrow. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to find footwear like that, right? That's why the only reason we sell footwear is because people in Canada cannot get that kind of footwear. And so we had to provide it. But you have to do a little bit more searching, but I promise you it's worth it. If your everyday shoe that you wear most frequently is a good shoe for your foot, that will be a very powerful force to mobilize and strengthen your foot. Okay, so flat, wide forefoot, flexible. Okay, so if you take a shoe, mine over there, but if you take a shoe, you should be able to twist it, scrumple it, bend it, all that kind of stuff. That means it's not going to inhibit the motion of those 33 joints in each of your feet. And the last one is thin, so thin sole. The thinner, the better. The thinner the sole is, the more sensory input you're going to get from the ground. The more you're going to feel all these different things like, rocks, curbs, angles, all that kind of stuff. Okay? And if you ditch, we talked about how cushioning is really just a way to deprive the sensory input from your foot. So we don't need cushioning. If you have cushioning in your shoes, it lets you walk very weirdly without realizing it, and especially with running. We won't get into that, but, and then arch support. Any support you give your foot externally is support you don't have to get from the muscles of your own foot. So arch support is really just a way to weaken your foot. And the more you wear arch support, the more you have to rely on it because you lose the ability to do it yourself. Okay? So that's footwear. We talk about orthotics. We started the TFC Audio Project podcast because topics like orthotics are very complex, multivariable topics. And to do a post on Instagram and write 5 lines of text, it's obviously going to piss some people off or it's going to be unclear. So the podcast, we did one on orthotics. So if you want a longer conversation about that, that's probably the best place to get it. But the reason we see orthotics is not a very effective way to treat foot dysfunction is because, number one, foot dysfunction really is an indicator that your hips aren't doing what they're supposed to most of the time, right? So looking at the hips and fixing those issues is a much better long-term solution than just giving your foot artificial support. And really, if you look at why people get plantar fasciitis or foot pain, foot-specific pain, a lot of times it's because their foot is stiff and weak. Okay? If you come see me with a stiff and weak and painful neck, I don't put you in a neck brace for the rest of your life, right? I try and get you to strengthen and mobilize your neck. And a muscle that's weak can be strengthened. A joint that's stiff can be mobilized. And that's what needs to be done to restore function in those areas. And so someone coming to see, if you have a stiff, weak foot and it's painful and you go see someone and they put you in orthotics, it'll probably make your foot feel better temporarily. But it's usually at the expense of making your foot stiffer and weaker. Right?
If you think about it, so a lot of the times the plantar fascia gets overloaded because all of the other things that are supposed to support the arch are basically not doing their job, and basically the plantar fascia is taking over the entire arch support role, right? So if you think about what other things that support the arch, all of the lower leg muscles that attach into the foot help support the arch. Your hip's ability to position your arch helps support your arch. All the intrinsic muscles underneath your plantar fascia in your foot, they're also big arch supporters. So if all these other things are not doing their job, it's just kind of an overload issue. Plantar fasciitis is an overload issue on the plantar fascia tissue, right? So we want to look at getting all these helpers into the game and off the bench, basically strengthening them over time so they can offload that plantar fascia so we can get things back on track. And like I say, orthotics does not do that. Orthotics just says, okay, you've overloaded that tissue, let's provide something to offload it even further, right? But then it misses the whole thing of like, why is this happening and what do we need to do to make this more sustainable?
So cool. So sometimes we balance beam work, like we always just mention this because what we found is with the balance beams, it allows us to get people on a challenging surface and see how their hips react. Okay? What balance beam work is neuromuscular problem solving. And I love it in clinic because it makes my job so much easier. I don't have to cue someone. I don't have to tell them to fire this or fire that. I just say, stand on the beam, don't look down, try not to fall off. And the beautiful part is that it doesn't matter how old you are, how strong you are, how flexible you are, you will improve very quickly. Why? Because all you're doing is reinforcing the feedback loop of, when I balance on a beam or balance on one foot, my foot sends a signal to my brain computes that signal, tells my hip what to do to stop me from falling over. That happens many, many times per second. The more efficient that pathway is, the better your balance. The more you practice balance, the more efficient that pathway becomes. Okay, it's neurological, it's brain work. It is not muscle work, and it's why so many people can improve very quickly. And why should you care about improving? Because that's what protects you from getting your knee and your ankle in nasty positions. Really, a beam puts you between an inversion ankle sprain and an ACL tear. It tells you where those two extremes are. It tells you how to avoid those two positions. And it also tells you how to protect yourself if you get close to that position. It tells what muscles to fire, in what way, at what strength to stop you from getting in that position and get back to optimal posture. It's kind of like a postural compass, because if you don't align everything from your foot to your hip to your head together, you're going to be off balance. And what you'll find, I encourage everyone to just stand on it for 60 seconds and see what it feels like, because not only is the rounded tube going to splay your foot and open it up, you have no choice but to use your foot and your hip on there, because if you don't, you fall over. Okay? So most people start with a 2x4, right? 2x4 of lumbar every day. Walk heel to toe without looking down, forward and backwards. You do that for 5 minutes a day, your balance will improve significantly. Okay, and balance is one of those things that people assume the older you get, the worse your balance is, but it's only because you spend less time on your feet or working on things that require balance that your balance degrades. And when a decrease in balance when you're 80 results in a hip fracture, that can be a serious threat to your livelihood. So it's probably in your best interest to train balance a little bit, or at least be mindful of it. Right? What's the value of spending time working on being strong on one leg? Well, walking is a series of phases of standing on one leg. Running is a series of phases standing on one leg. A lot of our life happens on one leg, so just train it to be good at it, and life becomes easy. Right? And it's really from the standpoint of injury prevention and performance, it's about making your body efficient at acknowledging what good posture is and how to basically recruit these little fine-tuning stabilizers at your hip and your foot to do their job so that all the big muscles like your calf and your low back don't have to take on the job of postural stabilizers, because they suck at it long term and they get tight, and then we start to run into problems. So anyway, I hope everyone enjoyed that. It's really, you know, it's always a forever work in progress, right? If I look back at the workshop 1.0 we gave 6 months ago, this is totally different, because as we learn new ways of delivering things, as we get feedback from people, we try and incorporate different things or try and give more in that 2 hours. So we're not going to expand the workshop beyond 2 hours, but we're going to try and pack different things in there and deliver in different ways that resonates more with people. So anyway, thank you for hosting us. Thanks everyone for coming. Hope you enjoyed it. And anyway, we have lacrosse balls and toe spreaders if anyone wants them. And like I said, we'll be around as we're cleaning up. Make sure you don't forget anything, and we'll leave this place nice and clean like we found it. So cool. Thanks for coming, everyone. Have a good rest of your Sunday.